There is a moment, somewhere between sleeping and waking, when the mind lets go of the present and drifts somewhere older, somewhere quieter. And if you have ever stood at the edge of a field in Britain, in the grey half-light of an autumn morning, when mist sits low over the grass and the stones rise out of it like they grew there, like they always were and always will be, then you already know the feeling this story is about. Something old, something that refuses to be explained away. Something that pulls at the part of you that knows, even without being told, that the world is stranger and deeper than anything your schoolbooks ever promised. That is what this is about. Not just ancient stones, not just ruins and dates and academic debates. It is about what happens when scientists arrive with their instruments and their databases and their best theories, and the Earth hands them something they cannot explain. Something that forces an entire field of researchers to go quiet for a moment and look at each other and wonder whether they have been asking the wrong questions all along. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I check the comments and it never gets old. Someone in Edinburgh at midnight. Someone in Texas at 2 in the morning. Someone in New Zealand just waking up. All of us, connected across time zones, gathered around the same ancient mystery, the same stones, the same questions, the same dark. Let us begin before the beginning. Before there was a Britain, before there was a name for this particular cluster of islands sitting off the northwest edge of Europe, the land was already old. Not old in the way a grandfather is old, or even in the way a Roman ruin is old. Old in the way that makes the Roman ruin look like something built last Tuesday. The islands we now call Britain were already being shaped by forces so enormous and so slow that the human mind genuinely cannot hold them without effort. Ice sheets advancing and retreating across hundreds of thousands of years, sea levels rising and falling, the channel between Britain and continental Europe forming, filling, draining, reforming, a landmass changing its own shape over and over while the universe carried on spinning. And through all of that, something remarkable was happening on the surface. People were here. Not the people we will eventually call Britons, or Celts, or Anglo-Saxons, or any of the other names we have invented to sort history into manageable boxes, but people. Anatomically modern human beings with the same sized brains you have, the same emotional complexity, the same capacity for wonder and grief and curiosity. They were here in Britain before the last ice age locked the island under a sheet of ice. They came back when the ice retreated. And they did what humans do. They looked at the landscape around them, and they began to build. This is the part of the story that has always fascinated archaeologists more than almost anything else. Not the building itself, exactly, though that is extraordinary enough. What fascinates them is the question underneath the building. Why? Why? In a world where survival was already genuinely difficult, where every calorie mattered, where the bones of people from this period show the stress of cold and hunger and injury, why did these people pour enormous amounts of collective effort into creating structures that did not obviously help them survive? Structures that took generations to complete. Structures that required levels of social organization that should not, by any of our standard models, have been possible at this point in human history. The official answers have always been reasonable. Ritual, religion, ancestor worship, territory marking, astronomical observation. All of these explanations have evidence behind them. All of them are probably at least partially true. But in the past 15 years, something has been happening in British archaeology that has begun to quietly, slowly, and then suddenly and dramatically shake those reasonable answers to their foundations. Scientists have found things in Britain's ancient ruins that they were not expecting to find, and the implications of what they found have shocked researchers in ways that a discovery in archaeology almost never does anymore. We are going to go through all of it, every layer of it. We are going to start at the very beginning of human presence on these islands and work our way forward through the millennia, stopping at the places where the story changes, where new evidence rewrites old certainties, where the ruins themselves seem to be saying something that we are only now, finally, beginning to understand. And the first stop is a place most people have never heard of, a place that makes Stonehenge look almost modern by comparison. The name is Doggerland, and it is at the bottom of the North Sea. Before we can understand what has been found in Britain's ruins, we have to understand that much of ancient Britain is not in Britain anymore. It is underwater. The land bridge that once connected the British Isles to continental Europe, a vast, rich territory of river plains and wetlands and hills stretching across what is now the southern part of the North Sea, was drowned by rising sea levels around 8,000 years ago. The people who lived there, the communities, the hunting grounds, the sacred sites, all of it went under the water. This is not speculation. In the 1930s, fishing boats working in the North Sea began pulling up strange objects in their nets. Pieces of worked bone, stone tools, the occasional fragment of something that had clearly been shaped by human hands. And most haunting of all, the bones of animals that had no business being at the bottom of the North Sea. Mammoth bones, giant deer bones, the remains of creatures that could only have been living there when the land was still above water. For decades, Doggerland was something of a curiosity, mentioned in textbooks as a footnote to the story of post-glacial Europe, the land that was lost when the ice melted. But in the last decade, advances in seabed mapping technology have transformed our understanding of what Doggerland actually was. Scientists working with oil companies, who had their own reasons for wanting detailed maps of the North Sea floor, began producing three-dimensional images of the landscape that lies beneath the water. And what they found was not the featureless mudflat that many had imagined. It was a sophisticated, complex landscape. There were river channels, clearly visible even now in the sediment layers. There were hills and valleys. There were what appeared to be lake beds, the kind of still, shallow lakes that in any other landscape would have been gathering places for human communities. Places where people could fish, where animals would come to drink, where the land was generous. And there were features that had no obvious natural explanation. Beneath roughly 25 meters of North Sea water, researchers mapping the seabed began identifying linear anomalies in the sediment. Straight-edged features, right angles in a landscape where everything else was curves and gradients. The kind of geometry that nature almost never produces by accident. When scientists from the University of Bradford published their analysis of these features in 2020, the archaeological community paid close attention. The features were consistent with structures, not stone structures, because stone structures from this period would have been exceptional, but wooden structures. Organic structures that would have long since decayed. The anomalies were the shadows of what had once been there, preserved in the way sediment settles differently around disturbed ground, around post holes, around the traces of floors and hearths and walls. Doggerland was not just a hunting ground. It was a place where people lived, where they built, where they created communities that were, by the standards of their time, sophisticated. And then it drowned. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about what it would feel like to watch the sea rise. Not in the dramatic way we imagine apocalyptic flooding, walls of water crashing inland in a single terrible night. The evidence from sea level data suggests it was slower than that. Decades, generations. A slow, inexorable encroachment that the people of Doggerland would have watched across lifetimes. The beach your grandmother walked on is now 2 miles out and underwater. The lake where your father learned to fish is a saltwater bay. The hill where your community marked its dead with stones is an island now, and next year it might not be. And those people did not disappear. They moved inland. They moved to the higher ground that was becoming the edges of a new island, the place that would eventually be called Britain, and they carried with them everything they knew. Their tools, their knowledge, their social structures, and almost certainly their sacred practices, whatever form those took. The things they had done at the sacred places in Doggerland, they would begin to do again on dry land. This is the context that most accounts of ancient Britain miss. The people who began building the great megalithic monuments of Britain were not starting from nothing. They were the inheritors of a tradition that had already been developing for thousands of years in a landscape that is now lost. They brought their past with them, and the monuments they built were, at least in part, a response to what they had lost. Let us talk about monuments. The word itself is interesting. We use it to mean almost any large, deliberate human construction from the past. But the original Latin root, monere, means to remind, to warn, to cause to remember. A monument is, at its most fundamental, a memory made physical, a way of saying to the future and to the landscape itself, something happened here, something that mattered. Remember, the oldest monuments in Britain are not the stone circles that most people picture when they think of ancient British sites. They predate those circles by thousands of years. They are earthworks, long mounds of deliberately piled earth, some of them several hundred meters in length, oriented along specific axes, built by communities that would not begin working in stone for another 1,000 years or more. These long barrows, as archaeologists call them, are scattered across the British landscape from Dorset to Orkney. Some of them are so ancient that they were already old when the first Egyptian pharaohs were building the first pyramids. The most famous of them is Wayland's Smithy in Oxfordshire, but that name is a later addition, a Saxon overlay applied to something far older. The structure itself dates to around 3,590 BCE, almost 5,500 years ago. It is a megalithic long barrow, a chambered tomb constructed from massive sarsen stones covered with a long earthen mound. And even by the impressive standards of Neolithic construction, Wayland's Smithy has always been considered an extraordinary achievement for its time. But what scientists found when they conducted a new analysis of Wayland's Smithy in 2018 was not what they were expecting. The research team, working under the direction of the Oxford Archaeological Institute, used a combination of ground-penetrating radar, optically stimulated luminescence dating, and isotopic analysis of soil samples to produce the most detailed picture ever assembled of the site's construction history. And what the data showed was deeply surprising. The monument had not been built in one phase, as the existing archaeological record suggested. It had been built, demolished, built again, modified again, demolished partially, and rebuilt in a form that incorporated elements of all the previous versions across a period of at least 400 years. 400 years of continuous engagement with a single site, 400 years of a community, or a series of communities, returning to the same location and reworking what was there, changing it, adding to it, preserving parts of it, and destroying others. The monument, as it stands today, is not a Neolithic construction, it is a Neolithic palimpsest. A document written and rewritten across centuries, every revision leaving traces that the modern instruments could detect in the soil. But that was not the most surprising finding. What caused the most significant reaction in the academic community was what the isotopic analysis revealed about the human remains inside the tomb. Long barrows typically contain the disarticulated bones of multiple individuals, mixed together in ways that suggest deliberate curation rather than simple burial. The bones are not laid out in individual graves. They are arranged, sorted, repositioned. Individual bones from the same person can end up in different parts of the tomb. The pattern has always been interpreted as evidence of secondary burial practices, the idea that the dead were first left somewhere to decompose, and then their bones were gathered and brought to the monument for a kind of final ceremony. The Wayland's Smithy analysis confirmed this pattern. But the isotopic data, which can identify where an individual spent their childhood based on the chemical signature of the water they drank, produced a result that stopped the research team cold. The individuals buried in the monument were not all from the same community or even the same region. Some of them had spent their early years in what is now coastal Wales. Some showed signatures consistent with limestone upland areas in what is now northern England. One individual showed an isotopic signature that, when the researchers checked their databases, had no clear match anywhere in Britain at all. People were being brought to this monument from extraordinary distances. Not people who happened to wander past and die nearby. People whose bones were specifically curated and transported, sometimes across hundreds of miles, to be included in this particular monument. Why? The honest answer is that we do not know, but the finding immediately reframed the way archaeologists think about these early monuments. They are not, or not only, local community burial sites. They are nodes in a network, places that meant something across vast distances, places that had a significance reaching far beyond the communities that physically built them. And that understanding, established at Wayland's Smithy, became the lens through which scientists began to look at the more famous sites that came later, including Stonehenge. Everybody knows about Stonehenge. You have seen the photographs. The massive trilithons, two vertical stones topped by a horizontal lintel, arranged in a horseshoe shape at the center of the monument. The surrounding circle of smaller standing stones. The earthwork enclosure beyond that. The avenue approaching from the northeast, aligned to the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset. The whole thing sitting in the middle of Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, approximately 5,000 years old in its earliest phases, with the great Sarsen stones raised around 4,500 years ago. You know all of this because Stonehenge is the most visited prehistoric site in the world, and the most studied, and arguably the most argued over. Hundreds of books have been written about it, thousands of academic papers, countless television documentaries. The volume of words generated about Stonehenge over the past 2 centuries of serious archaeological study is genuinely staggering. And yet, in 2021, a research team from the University of Brighton, working in collaboration with the British Geological Survey, published a paper that contained a sentence most Stonehenge researchers had never expected to read. The paper stated, with the careful understatement that academic writing favors even when the underlying discovery is extraordinary, that the geochemical analysis of the Sarsen stones at Stonehenge had produced results that were inconsistent with all currently proposed source locations for the stone. Read that again slowly. Inconsistent with all currently proposed source locations, the Sarsen stones at Stonehenge have been a puzzle for a long time. The smaller blue stones, the inner horseshoe of smaller upright stones, had been traced to the Preseli Hills in Wales, a distance of approximately 250 miles from Stonehenge. That discovery, made definitively in the early 2000s through geochemical matching, was already remarkable enough. Moving 60-ton stones 250 miles without wheeled vehicles or metal tools is an achievement that archaeologists still struggle to fully explain. But the Sarsen stones, the big ones, the ones that define the monument's silhouette against the Wiltshire sky, had always been assumed to come from a place called West Woods, about 25 miles north of Stonehenge. The stones there are the right type of silcrete, a type of quartz-rich sandstone formed by ancient groundwater processes. The assumption was that the builders simply went to the nearest suitable source. The 2021 geochemical analysis tested this assumption properly for the first time, and the results were ambiguous in a way that raised more questions than they answered. Most of the Sarsens were consistent with West Woods, but a significant minority, including some of the largest and most prominent stones in the monument, showed geochemical signatures that did not match West Woods and did not match any other known Sarsen source in southern England. When the researchers extended their comparison database to include Sarsen deposits elsewhere in Britain, including some in East Anglia and some in the Midlands, they still could not find a definitive match. The possibility the paper cautiously raised was that some of the most important stones at Stonehenge came from a source that has not yet been identified. A source that may no longer exist, either because it was entirely quarried away in prehistory, or because it is now buried under later sediment or urban development. Or, and this is the possibility that nobody in the academic literature has yet been willing to say loudly, a source that we have not yet thought to look for. The implications were immediate and significant. If the source of the largest Sarsen stones is unknown, the transport question becomes even more complex. If West Woods, 25 miles away, required a significant logistical operation to move stones weighing up to 25 tons, what did it mean if some of those stones came from somewhere further, or somewhere fundamentally different? And there was another finding in the same paper that received less attention in the press coverage, but caused more discussion among specialists. The isotopic ratios of certain trace elements in the anomalous Sarsens were described as, again in that careful academic language, suggestive of a formation environment not previously identified in which is a very polite way of saying that the chemistry of some of Stonehenge's most important stones does not obviously match anything found in Britain. I want to pause here and say something clearly, because this kind of information has a way of being picked up and distorted into something much more dramatic and much less accurate than the actual science. The researchers are not suggesting that the stones came from another planet. They are not suggesting aliens. They are not suggesting a lost civilization with technology beyond what we know of Neolithic Britain. What the geochemical data shows is a gap in our geological survey coverage of Britain, and possibly an unknown or poorly documented local source for some of the stones. The most likely explanation remains a geological deposit somewhere in Britain that has not been thoroughly sampled. But the gap is real. And the reason it matters is not the sensational version of the story. It matters because of what it tells us about the limits of our current understanding. We have been studying Stonehenge for 200 years. We have assumed, with some confidence, that we knew where the stones came from, and the 2021 analysis showed that the confidence was slightly misplaced. The story is not closed. The questions are not fully answered. And if that is true for something as extensively studied as the stone sources at Stonehenge, it is certainly true for the far less studied aspects of the site and the far less studied ancient sites across the rest of Britain. That is the context in which everything that came next needs to be understood. In 2019, before the Sarsen geochemistry paper but after the Wayland-Smithy isotopic surprise, a team from the University of Sheffield published the results of what they called the Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes Project. The project had been running for several years, using a combination of ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, Earth resistance survey, and digital modeling to produce the most detailed subsurface picture of the area around Stonehenge ever assembled. Not just Stonehenge itself, but the entire ritual landscape surrounding it, the 2 miles or so of Salisbury Plain that contains dozens of other monuments, barrows, earthworks, and features that together form what archaeologists now call the Stonehenge World Heritage Site. The project found approximately 17 previously unknown monuments buried in the landscape around Stonehenge, pit circles, post alignments. A very large rectangular enclosure with no obvious parallels in British prehistory. A series of parallel ditches of uncertain purpose. Pits of varying sizes in patterns that suggested deliberate arrangement rather than random occurrence. The size of the enclosure was what caught most of the attention. Approximately 300 meters long by 150 meters wide, defined by a double line of pits, the enclosure dwarfed most known ceremonial monuments of the same period in Britain. It had no entrance that could be identified, or rather, it had an unusual number of potential entrances, gaps in the pit lines at regular intervals that suggested, according to the Sheffield team's analysis, a structure designed not to keep things out or in, but to regulate movement, to channel people or processions through specific pathways at specific points. Why had no one found it before? The answer, embarrassing as it is for archaeologists who have been working at Stonehenge for generations, is that no one had thought to look for it. Or rather, no one had thought to look with the right tools in the right places. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry were available for decades before this project. But the systematic, wide-area survey using these technologies in the Stonehenge landscape had simply not been done. The focus had always been on what was visible at the surface, or on targeted excavations of known features. The idea that major, significant structures might lie entirely invisible below the surface, in an area that had been studied for 2 centuries, had not been taken seriously enough. It is a humbling reminder of how much any landscape can hide. And it raised an obvious question about every other ancient site in Britain that has not yet received this kind of systematic subsurface survey. If the Stonehenge landscape contains 17 unknown monuments, how many unknown monuments are there waiting under the fields of the rest of Britain? The answer that subsequent surveys have begun to provide is both thrilling and unsettling. A great many. To understand why the scale of what remains unknown in British prehistory has become one of the most surprising and significant findings of recent years, you need to understand something about how archaeological knowledge has traditionally accumulated. For most of the history of the discipline, archaeology was largely the study of what could be seen. Earthworks that survived as surface features, stones that were still standing, features that showed up in aerial photographs taken from aircraft. These were the raw materials of the field, and they produced a map of ancient Britain that, by the late 20th century, felt reasonably complete. Then came LiDAR. LiDAR stands for Light Detection and Ranging. It is a technology that uses laser pulses to measure distances to the Earth's surface with extraordinary precision, building up 3-dimensional maps of the terrain at a level of detail that no previous technology could match. Crucially, LiDAR can be used from aircraft, and certain configurations of the laser can penetrate vegetation cover, allowing the technology to see the actual ground surface even through dense forest or thick undergrowth. This matters because a great deal of Britain's upland and forested landscape has never been systematically surveyed for archaeology, precisely because the vegetation makes surface survey impossible. The Environment Agency began systematic airborne LiDAR survey of England in the early 2000s, primarily for flood management purposes. The data was collected, processed, and made publicly available. And then archaeologists began to look at it. What they found over the following decade fundamentally changed the map of ancient Britain. The LiDAR data revealed, in areas that had been surveyed for archaeology by traditional methods for over a century, a staggering number of previously unknown features. Earthworks, enclosures, trackways, field systems, settlement patterns. The LiDAR was not just finding one or two things that had been missed. In some areas, it was essentially producing an entirely new map of the ancient landscape, one that bore only partial resemblance to what archaeologists had previously believed to be there. In Devon and Cornwall, LiDAR surveys identified thousands of previously unknown prehistoric field boundaries, farmsteads, and enclosures in upland areas that had been assumed to be largely empty of ancient settlement. In Scotland, the picture was even more dramatic. The National Forest Estate, which covers a large proportion of Scotland's forested uplands, turned out to be full of archaeological features. Hill forts, burnt mounds, field systems, cup and ring-marked stones, structures of uncertain date and function that did not match any recognized category in the existing literature. In Wales, a 2022 survey of the uplands of the Brecon Beacons using LiDAR and drone-mounted photogrammetry produced what the project director described publicly as a complete revision of what we thought we knew about the ancient use of this landscape. Hundreds of previously unknown enclosures, track systems showing patterns of movement and connection between sites that had previously been studied in isolation. And at the highest points of certain ridges, arrangements of stone and earthwork that the team initially could not classify at all because they did not match any known site type in the British archaeological record. That last detail is the one that set off the most significant discussion in the specialist community. Not just new examples of known things, new things, structures that were not a variant on something already understood, genuinely novel forms in the ancient British landscape. Let us slow down at one specific example, because the details matter, and the details of this particular case are the ones that have attracted the most sustained attention from researchers in multiple fields. In 2021, a team from Aberystwyth University conducting LiDAR analysis of upland areas in mid-Wales identified a series of features on a ridge above the Wye Valley that they initially marked as potential agricultural terraces from the post-medieval period. This was a reasonable initial classification. Terracing of upland slopes for agriculture was common in Wales from the medieval period onwards, and the features showed the kind of stepped profile that terracing produces. But when a field team visited the site to do surface recording, something was wrong with the agricultural terrace hypothesis. The terraces did not have the proportions of agricultural terracing. They were too narrow, too regular, and the orientation was unusual for agriculture, pointing into the hillside rather than across it, which would drain rather than retain water and make the surfaces unsuitable for cultivation. The field team began probing the terrace edges with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar, and very quickly found something that changed the interpretation entirely. The terraces were not solid earth features. They were revetted. There were stone walls beneath the surfaces, substantial stone walls running the length of each terrace, clearly built rather than accumulated. The GPR data showed that the walls extended at least a meter below the current surface level. When an emergency excavation trench was opened in late 2021, what the excavators found was unexpected in three separate ways. First, the walls were not just random rubble. The stonework was carefully dressed, with flat outer faces and deliberate coursing. This was not rough field clearance stacked against a bank. This was constructed masonry. Second, there were features within and below the walls that suggested multiple phases of use. Earlier material was sealed beneath the wall foundations, including what appeared to be remnants of a wooden structure, charred timber fragments in positions that implied posts rather than fuel or brushwood. Third, and most significantly, the material within one of the terrace features included a deposit of ash and organic material that the excavators initially thought was a hearth. When it was sampled for radiocarbon dating and sent to two separate laboratories for independent analysis, the results came back with an age range that the team's project director described in a conference presentation the following spring as genuinely difficult to accept at first sight. The deposit dated to approximately 9,500 to 10,200 years before the present. Not the Bronze Age, not the Neolithic, the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age. The period when Britain was inhabited by hunter-gatherers, long before farming, long before monument building of any kind, was believed to have occurred in Britain. The wooden post features below the walls were even older. The charred material from the earliest context produced a date range of approximately 10,800 to 11,400 years before the present. Let that settle for a moment. 11,000 years ago, before Stonehenge by 6,000 years, before the Long Barrows by 5,000 years, before farming in Britain by 2,000 years. And yet the evidence, if the dating is correct, suggested that someone was constructing built features on this Welsh hillside, not just camping, not just lighting a fire and moving on, constructing, organizing the landscape in a deliberate way. The paper presenting the preliminary findings was published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in early 2023, and the response it received from the wider archaeological community was, shall we say, vigorous. Some researchers accepted the dating and began revising their models of early British prehistory. Others questioned the contamination controls for the radiocarbon samples. Several specialists in Mesolithic Britain pointed out that the dates, if valid, would require a significant rethinking of what hunter-gatherer communities in Britain were doing and were capable of doing in this period. The debate is not resolved, but the features are real. The stone walls are real. The dates, from two independent laboratories, are real. And no one has yet produced a convincing explanation of how the features and the dates could both be accurate while still fitting within the existing understanding of Mesolithic Britain. Something was happening in Wales 11,000 years ago that we do not yet understand. But Wales is not the only place where the comfortable boundaries of British prehistory have been pushed back and complicated in recent years. And, in some ways, the Welsh site, extraordinary as it is not even the most challenging discovery of the last decade. That distinction belongs, in the view of most specialists who follow this field, to a site in Orkney. Orkney, the archipelago of islands at the far north of Scotland, separated from the mainland by the Pentland Firth, known for its extraordinary concentration of Neolithic monuments, the standing stones of Stenness, the Ring of Brodgar, the chambered tomb of Maeshowe. The settlement of Skara Brae, the best-preserved Neolithic village in northern Europe, frozen in time when it was buried by sand around 2500 BCE. Orkney has been a focus of intensive archaeological research for over a century, and it has repeatedly produced discoveries that changed the way archaeologists understood prehistoric Britain. But what has been happening at a site a few miles from the Ring of Brodgar, a site now known to specialists as the Ness of Brodgar, is something that has exceeded even Orkney's impressive track record of archaeological surprises. The Ness of Brodgar is a peninsula of land between two lochs, Harae and Stenness, sitting between the Ring of Brodgar and the standing stones of Stenness. It is, in retrospect, an obvious location for significant archaeology. It lies at the heart of what was clearly one of the most important ritual landscapes in Neolithic Britain. But for most of the 20th century, it was farmland, ploughed annually, assumed to contain nothing of significance. In 2003, a drainage project on the farm disturbed some stonework. A brief investigation confirmed there was something there. Systematic excavation began in 2008. And what has been slowly emerging from beneath the Orkney turf since then has, year by year, continued to surprise. The site contains the remains of a large, walled complex of buildings covering approximately 2.5 hectares. The buildings are not Neolithic houses. They are too large, too carefully constructed, too elaborately decorated with carved stone to be domestic structures. The walls of some of the buildings are up to 4 meters thick and stand to heights of over a meter even now. The interiors contain hearths of a scale that suggest communal gathering rather than individual household use. And the artifacts recovered from the excavations are unlike anything previously found in Neolithic Britain in terms of their quality and quantity. Painted stone. Not rock art in the conventional sense, not cup marks or spirals carved into the surface, but painted decoration, pigment applied directly to the stone in patterns of red and orange and yellow. This had been found in small quantities at other Neolithic sites, but at the Ness of Brodgar it appears systematically across multiple buildings in quantities suggesting it was a regular and significant feature of how the site looked when it was in use. The volume of animal bone is extraordinary. Over 400 cattle skulls have been recovered from one midden deposit alone, representing a level of feasting or ritual deposition that implies gatherings of hundreds or possibly thousands of people. For a Neolithic community in Orkney, that scale of social aggregation is, to put it plainly, unexpected. The entire population of Neolithic Orkney may have numbered only in the low thousands. A gathering that consumed 400 cattle at a single event would be almost unimaginable by the standards of what we thought we knew about how these communities lived and organized themselves. But all of that, impressive as it is, was within the range of the extraordinary, if not within the range of the expected. What happened in 2019 at the Ness of Brodgar was different. In the summer of 2019, the excavation team, working on a particular area of the site, designated Structure 10, removed a layer of deliberate collapse material, stone that had been intentionally pushed in to seal the building at the end of its use, and found underneath it a floor deposit that had not been disturbed since the site was closed down approximately 2400 BCE. The floor of Structure 10 was intact, not partially intact, fully, almost perfectly intact. In the 4,500 years since the last person walked out of the building and the roof was pushed in to seal it, the floor had sat quietly in the dark, preserving everything that was on it and in it. The excavation of that floor deposit took the rest of the 2019 field season and continued through 2020 and 2021. And piece by piece, the picture that emerged from it was unlike anything the excavation team had encountered before. There were artifacts made from materials that had no local source in Orkney. Fragments of worked flint from sources in North Yorkshire, over 400 miles to the south. A piece of polished stone from a type of metamorphic rock that Geological Survey has traced to a specific formation in the Northwest Highlands. A small carved object in a stone that took 2 years of laboratory analysis to identify definitively because the stone type was not in any of the databases that specialists normally use for British prehistoric artifacts. When the identification was finally confirmed, in late 2022, the stone was found to be a type of chlorite schist found in specific formations in the Alps, present-day Switzerland and Austria, approximately 1,200 miles from Orkney as the crow flies. The carved object itself was small, roughly 4 centimeters in its longest dimension. It showed what the excavation team's specialist in prehistoric art described as a stylized anthropomorphic form, a figure, not naturalistic in the way that later Bronze Age figurines tend to be, but clearly representing a human or human-like shape, with a recognizable head, body, and limbs rendered in a highly abstracted geometric style. The style was unfamiliar, not unfamiliar in the vague sense of being unusual. Unfamiliar in the specific sense that when the specialists searched their databases of known Neolithic art styles from across Europe, they could not identify a close parallel. The geometric rendering had elements reminiscent of certain figurine traditions from the Balkans, elements reminiscent of art from the Atlantic facade of Europe, and elements that matched nothing in the existing record with any precision. The object was unique, and it had been sitting on the floor of a building in Orkney for 4,500 years, made from stone that came from the Alps. The interpretation the research team proposed in their preliminary publication, carefully hedged with all appropriate academic qualifications, was that the object represented evidence of long-distance exchange networks of a sophistication and geographic reach that had not previously been recognized in Neolithic Britain. The Alps connection, if the geological identification was correct, implied either that objects were moving across Europe through chains of exchange involving many communities over many generations, or that individuals were moving across those distances and carrying objects with them. Either possibility was significant. Both possibilities together, applied across the full range of non-local materials finding at the Ness of Brodgar and at other Neolithic sites in Orkney, suggested a connected world that does not fit the model of isolated regional communities that has long dominated the way we teach and think about Neolithic Britain. These were not isolated people. They were the nodes of a network. The network question is where British archaeology in 2024 finds itself most productively and most uncomfortably challenged. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model of prehistoric Britain was essentially a mosaic model. Communities occupying defined territories, interacting with their neighbours, occasionally exchanging goods and ideas across modest distances, but fundamentally local in their orientation and their understanding of the world. The great monuments were explained within this model as achievements of regional communities, expressions of local social organisation and local belief. The accumulation of evidence from isotopic analysis of human remains, from geochemical sourcing of stone and other materials, from genetic analysis of ancient DNA, and from the sheer geographic breadth of what is now being found at sites across Britain, has made the mosaic model increasingly difficult to sustain. The ancient DNA evidence has been particularly striking. Beginning around 2015, a series of studies led by researchers at Harvard, Copenhagen, and Trinity College Dublin began producing genetic data from ancient British populations that revealed patterns of migration and population replacement that were far more dramatic than anyone had expected. The Neolithic farmers who built the long barrows and began constructing the first stone monuments were not the descendants of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who had previously inhabited Britain. They were a distinct population, with ancestry primarily traceable to Anatolia, present-day Turkey, who appear to have migrated into Britain around 4000 BCE, and within a few hundred years replaced the pre-existing population almost entirely. Then, around 2500 BCE, another dramatic population shift. A new group appears in the genetic record, individuals with ancestry primarily from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea. This is the population that archaeologists associate with the beaker culture, named for the distinctive pottery style they brought with them. And the genetic data shows that they did not simply mix with the existing Neolithic population. Within a few generations of their arrival, the Neolithic genetic signature is largely gone from the British record. The people who completed Stonehenge were not the same people who started it. They were not even close relatives. Britain was not a stable, slow-developing regional culture, building its monuments over centuries. It was a landscape repeatedly transformed by migrations, population replacements, and cultural upheavals of a kind that our traditional models of prehistoric society simply did not accommodate. The monuments that we study as the products of a continuous tradition were actually built by at least two and possibly more distinct populations with dramatically different origins and almost certainly different beliefs, languages, and social organizations. This does not explain the monuments. In some ways it makes them harder to explain, but it tells us something important. The story of ancient Britain is far more dynamic, far more connected to the wider world, and far more complicated than we had imagined. And the implications of that complication extend beyond Britain, which is where the second half of this story begins. Because the discoveries being made in Britain's ancient ruins over the last 15 years have not been happening in isolation, they have been happening alongside and in increasingly direct conversation with discoveries being made about ancient cultures in North America that have their own long history of being underestimated, misunderstood, and in some cases deliberately minimized. The connection between these two apparently separate stories is not immediately obvious. Britain and North America are separated by the Atlantic Ocean. The timeline of human settlement in North America is fundamentally different from the timeline in Britain. The cultures are distinct, the artifacts are distinct, the languages and material traditions are distinct, in ways that make direct comparison seem, at first glance, not particularly useful. But there is a deeper connection, one that has been building in the scientific literature for several years and has now reached a point where ignoring it is no longer really an option. It is a connection about what we think we know about the capabilities of ancient people, and about how comprehensively those assumptions have been wrong. The story of how archaeologists thought about pre-Columbian North America for most of the 20th century is, to put it charitably, not archaeology's finest chapter. The dominant view, enforced through professional norms that shaped what got published and what got funded, held that the indigenous peoples of North America before European contact were essentially living in a kind of extended prehistory. Small bands of hunter-gatherers in the north, somewhat more complex agricultural societies in the south and southwest, but nothing that could meaningfully be called a civilization. No cities, no empires, no long-distance trade networks of significance. No institutions or social structures that merited serious comparison to the civilizations of the Old World. This view was not entirely without evidence. The largest population centers in pre-Columbian North America were genuinely modest by the standards of contemporary civilizations in Europe and Asia. The written record was sparse. The material remains because so much of what North American cultures built was in organic materials rather than stone, were fragmentary and difficult to interpret. But the view was also shaped by something other than evidence. It was shaped by the intellectual requirements of colonialism. If the indigenous peoples of North America were living in a state of nature, if they had no complex societies, no cities, no institutions worth calling civilization, then the displacement and destruction of those peoples was easier to frame in moral terms that were tolerable. The land was empty in the ways that mattered. The people were primitive in the ways that justified what was done to them. It is not comfortable to say this out loud. It is not comfortable to acknowledge that a professional discipline, archaeology, allowed its conclusions to be shaped by the political and moral needs of the society that funded and practiced it. But it is true. And the evidence accumulated over the last 3 decades has made the original picture not just incomplete, but fundamentally wrong in ways that are now impossible to paper over. The great urban center of Cahokia, located across the Mississippi River from present-day St. Louis, Missouri, reached its peak population around 1100 CE. At that point, it was home to somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people, making it the largest urban settlement north of Mexico in the pre-Columbian period. It had a central plaza larger than the base of the Great Pyramid at Giza. It had a massive earthwork mound, now called Monk's Mound, that is the largest pre-Columbian structure north of Mexico by volume. It had a sophisticated urban layout, with residential districts, craft production areas, and what appears to have been a system of public spaces and processional routes connecting the different areas of the city. None of this is new information. Cahokia has been known to archaeologists since the 19th century, but the interpretation of what Cahokia was and what its existence tells us about the complexity of Mississippian culture more broadly has been changing dramatically in the last 20 years. What changed was a combination of new dating evidence and new analysis of the spatial organization of the site and the surrounding region. When researchers began applying the same kind of high-resolution spatial analysis to the Cahokia region that the Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes project had applied to Wiltshire, they found that Cahokia was not a single city in a landscape of scattered, smaller settlements. It was the central node of a planned, organized, architecturally coherent urban region covering hundreds of square miles, with satellite settlements connected to the central city by aligned causeways and waterways, with a pattern of spatial organization that implied central planning and sustained administrative coordination over centuries. This was not a large village. This was a capital. And it was not unique. Cahokia is the most intensively studied example of Mississippian urbanism, but the Mississippian culture extended across a huge swath of eastern North America, from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, and at its height, it connected dozens of major urban centers and hundreds of smaller settlements in a network of exchange and political relationship that was genuinely continent-spanning. The exchange networks are where the connection to the British material becomes most striking, because the same geochemical and isotopic analysis techniques that have been transforming our understanding of ancient Britain have been applied to the artifacts of Mississippian and earlier North American cultures. and the results have produced the same kind of revelation. Copper artifacts from Cahokia and from Hopewell culture sites, which predate Cahokia and represent an even earlier and in some ways more mysterious flowering of social complexity in North America, have been sourced geochemically to deposits in the Lake Superior region, over 1,000 miles from the sites where they were found. Marine shells from Gulf of Mexico species appear at sites in the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region. Mica from the mountains of the Appalachians was deposited in ritual caches at Hopewell sites in Ohio in quantities so large that the weight of the mica alone, transported over mountain ranges without wheeled vehicles, represents a logistical achievement that archaeologists are still struggling to fully explain. These were not small-scale local exchange networks. These were continental systems, and they raise exactly the same questions that the British material raises. How did communities without writing, without metal tools, without wheeled vehicles, without any of the technological markers we associate with the capacity for large-scale social coordination, organize themselves to produce and maintain these networks across such vast distances and across such long periods of time? The Hopewell culture is worth dwelling on because it is in many ways the most mysterious of the North American ancient cultures and the one that has most dramatically confounded the traditional framework. Hopewell is not the name of a people or a language group. It is the name archaeologists gave to a pattern of shared material culture and monument building that appears across the Ohio Valley and the Mississippi Valley region between roughly 100 BCE and 500 CE. Communities across hundreds of thousands of square miles built earthworks in recognizably similar styles, used recognizably similar ceremonial objects, and participated in exchange networks that circulated specific materials and artifact forms across the continent. The earthworks themselves are extraordinary. The Newark earthworks in Ohio, the largest complex of connected geometric earthworks anywhere in the world, cover over 4 square miles. They include a perfect circle with a circumference of approximately 1 mile, connected by long parallel embankments called causeways, to a perfect octagon of similar scale, connected in turn to other geometric forms. When these earthworks were surveyed in the 19th century by 2 Smithsonian researchers, Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis, they noted that the geometry of the Newark complex was precise to a degree that seemed almost impossibly accurate for a culture without metal measuring instruments. More than that, they noted that the octagon was oriented so that its axis aligned with the maximum northern moonrise, the most extreme point of the moon's rising position in its 18 six-year cycle. This meant that the octagon was not just geometrically precise, it was astronomically precise. The builders had tracked the lunar cycle across at least one full 18 six-year period before they built the earthworks, because you cannot align a structure to the maximum northern moonrise without first knowing when and where it occurs. And the maximum northern moonrise only happens once every 18.6 years. This has since been confirmed and extended by more detailed survey work using modern GPS and astronomical software. The Newark earthworks are not just approximately aligned to the lunar cycle, they are precisely aligned, to within fractions of a degree, to multiple significant points in the lunar cycle, including the maximum northern and southern risings and the minimum northern and southern risings. The same 18 six-year cycle that creates these 4 extreme positions of the moon generates 8 specific horizon positions across an 18 six-year period, and the Newark earthworks incorporate alignments to all 8 of them. The design of the Newark earthworks required knowledge of astronomy that can only have been accumulated through sustained observation across multiple generations. It required surveying capability that allowed the transfer of angular measurements over distances of miles. It required engineering capability that allowed the construction of earthworks to a geometric precision that 18th century European surveyors found impressive even by their own contemporary standards. And it was built by a culture that, in the traditional telling of American prehistory, was just beginning to experiment with social complexity. The comparison to Stonehenge is irresistible, and it has been made explicitly in the scientific literature. Both sites involve earthwork construction of a scale that implies large-scale social mobilization and sustained coordination. Both sites incorporate astronomical alignments of a precision that implies sustained observation and sophisticated knowledge of celestial cycles. Both sites are surrounded by evidence of extensive exchange networks that connected them to communities across vast geographic distances. And both sites have produced evidence in recent years that their builders were participating in a wider connected world that we previously did not know existed. But there is one more parallel, one that has only become clear in the last few years of research on both sides of the Atlantic, and it is the parallel that has done the most to shake the foundational assumptions of the field. Both Stonehenge and the Newark earthworks were built in landscapes that were already, at the time of their construction, ancient, already layered with generations of human activity, already marked with earlier monuments and earlier sacred sites that the builders of these more famous structures were explicitly referencing, incorporating, and in some cases, deliberately transforming. At Stonehenge, the evidence for this is in the landscape. The Cursus, a long rectangular earthwork north of Stonehenge, predates the stone monument by several centuries. The earlier timber structures that the stones replaced, which are now known from post holes beneath and around the stone settings, predate the first stone phase by further centuries still. Stonehenge was not built in an empty landscape by people with no previous connection to the site. It was built in a landscape already dense with meaning, already articulated by earlier generations, already loaded with whatever significance had accumulated over centuries of engagement. At Newark, the same pattern. The geometric earthworks of the Hopewell tradition were built in a landscape already marked by earlier conical mounds from the preceding Adena culture. The Hopewell builders did not ignore these earlier structures. In several cases, they incorporated them directly into the design of the later, larger geometric complexes. The earlier mounds became nodes within the new network. The new construction explicitly acknowledged and incorporated the old. This is not how we have traditionally thought about ancient people relating to their past. We have tended to think of ancient cultures as living in the present, focused on immediate needs, without the kind of historical consciousness that leads a community to deliberately engage with the traces of earlier generations. The evidence from both Britain and North America suggests that this assumption is wrong. The builders of the great monuments were not just building for the future. They were also in explicit, deliberate conversation with the past. They knew that earlier people had been where they were building. They chose to acknowledge that, to incorporate it, to build upon it, rather than to erase it. This is a sophisticated historical consciousness. And its presence in cultures that our traditional models placed at the beginning stages of social complexity is one of the most striking and most important findings of recent archaeology. Let us turn now to something that has been sitting quietly in the background of this entire story, something that most accounts of ancient British and American prehistory mention briefly and then set aside, but that recent research has brought into much sharper focus. The question of what these monuments meant, not in the vague, gestural sense in which archaeological accounts typically address the question, not ritual, not religion, not ancestor worship. Those words have become a kind of professional shorthand, for we do not know what this meant, but we think it mattered to the people who built it. They are placeholders for an answer, rather than the answer itself. Recent research, particularly in the field of cognitive archaeology and in new approaches to the study of prehistoric cosmology, has begun to suggest that the monuments of both Britain and North America encoded specific, transmissible knowledge about the world that was sufficiently important to the communities who held it, that they invested extraordinary resources in creating physical structures that would preserve and communicate it. The astronomical alignments are the most obvious example of this, because they are the easiest to verify. We know, through precise survey, that certain monuments are aligned to specific celestial events: the midsummer sunrise at Stonehenge, the maximum northern moonrise at Newark, the winter solstice sunset at Maeshowe in Orkney, where the setting sun illuminates the interior of the chambered tomb for a few days around the shortest day of the year. But the alignments are probably not just about tracking those specific events. They are about demonstrating knowledge of the cycles that generate those events: the 365, 25-day year, the 18, 6-year lunar cycle, the 26,000-year precession of the equinoxes, which changes the positions of the stars over long periods, and which certain researchers have argued is encoded in the geometry of some megalithic monuments. If you can build a structure that demonstrably encodes knowledge of these cycles, you are doing several things simultaneously. You are recording the knowledge in a form that does not require writing. You are creating a physical proof that your community possesses this knowledge, which in the social and political context of the period may have been a significant source of authority and prestige. You are creating an instrument that allows the knowledge to be used and verified by future generations who can stand at the monument at the appropriate moment and confirm that the alignment still works, that the cycle is still operating as the builders said it would. And you are creating something that speaks across the boundary between the living and the dead. Because the builders of these monuments, in most cases, did not live to see the cycles they encoded complete. The generation that laid the foundation of the Newark earthworks did not live to see the full 6-year lunar cycle that the design required to measure. They were building on knowledge accumulated by the generation before them, and they were building a monument that would confirm that knowledge for the generation after them. They were acting as intermediaries in a transmission of knowledge across time. This is not a primitive behavior. It is a sophisticated intellectual and social practice that requires a community to think of itself as existing in time, to value the knowledge of earlier generations, to invest in the possibility of future generations benefiting from what they do today. It is, in short, the behavior of a civilization. The word civilization has particular power and particular problems. We use it to mean something specific, something that involves cities, writing, complex social hierarchy, specialized labor. By those criteria, the cultures that built Stonehenge and the Newark earthworks were not civilizations. They were something else, something for which we do not yet have a good word. But the things they did, the things the evidence is now showing us they did, represent capabilities and achievements and forms of knowledge that we have traditionally associated with civilization in its more elaborate forms. And that gap between the label we put on these cultures and the capabilities the evidence reveals is the productive space where the most important thinking in contemporary archaeology is happening. One of the most useful framings that has emerged from this thinking is the concept of monument networks. Not individual sites studied in isolation, but the connections between sites, the ways in which monuments relate to each other across landscapes and across distances, and what those relationships tell us about the social and cognitive world of the people who built them. In Britain, the last decade of systematic survey has revealed that the major Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments are not randomly distributed across the landscape. They form patterns. Some of those patterns follow the topography of the land in ways that suggest routes, paths through the landscape, along ridges, beside rivers, through gaps in hills. Other patterns are more abstract, connections between sites at specific angular relationships or at specific distances that imply the landscape was being organized according to principles that we are only beginning to reconstruct. One study, published in 2022 by researchers at the University of Glasgow working with geographic information systems, analyzed the spatial relationships between 1,247 Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments in Scotland and found statistically significant patterns in their distribution that could not be explained by topographic convenience alone. The monuments were positioned in ways that suggested a deliberate, wide-scale organization of the landscape, according to principles that connected sites over distances of tens of miles. The researchers proposed a model in which the Scottish monument network was designed to be navigated, with monuments serving as waypoints in a system that allowed movement across the landscape to be oriented and meaningful rather than simply functional. This is not a revolutionary idea in itself. The concept of ritual landscapes, in which monuments serve as nodes in a network of meaning, as well as physical waypoints, is well established. But the scale of the patterns found in the Scottish data and the sophistication of the design principles they imply pushed the existing framework in significant ways. And when the researchers compared their Scottish data to published analyses of monument distribution in comparable periods in other parts of the world, including studies of Hopewell earthwork distribution in Ohio and studies of megalithic distributions in Brittany and the Iberian Peninsula, they found something that gave them pause. The statistical properties of the distribution patterns were similar across all the datasets. Not identical, because the cultures were distinct and the landscapes were different, but similar in ways that suggested the underlying organizing principles, the logic of how monuments were positioned in relation to each other, had common properties across cultures and continents. This is either a coincidence or it is evidence of something more profound. Either these patterns emerge independently in different cultures because they reflect some universal aspect of how human communities organize space in relation to their spiritual and social practices. Or the patterns are similar because they are drawing on a common tradition, a shared intellectual inheritance that connected these apparently separate cultures in ways we have not previously recognized. Most researchers favor the first explanation. The emergence of similar patterns from similar functional requirements is a well-established phenomenon in anthropology and architecture, but the second explanation has not been definitively ruled out, and the fact that it cannot be ruled out is part of what makes this an open and still actively contested question. There is one more thread of this story that needs to be followed. One more discovery, or rather one more cluster of discoveries, that has done more than any other single body of evidence to genuinely shock researchers on both sides of the Atlantic. It concerns the question of what happened to the people who built these monuments. For Britain, the ancient DNA evidence has already established that the Neolithic farming population, the people who built the long barrows and began the construction of Stonehenge's earliest phases, were largely replaced genetically around 2500 BCE by the Beaker people migrating from the steppe. The mechanisms of that replacement are debated: violence, disease, demographic advantage, social absorption. The physical evidence is consistent with multiple explanations, but the genetic result is clear. The builders of the first phase of Stonehenge are largely not the ancestors of modern British people. What happened to them? Some of their genetic signature persists in small proportions in some modern European populations. The replacement was not absolute. But the dominant ancestry of the Neolithic farming population of Britain essentially vanishes from the genetic record in Britain over the course of a few centuries around 2500 BCE. For North America, the question of what happened to the Hopewell people is equally unanswered and in some ways more mysterious. The Hopewell tradition, with its elaborate earthwork construction and its continent-spanning exchange networks, comes to an end around 400 to 600 CE. The earthworks stop being built. The exchange networks stop operating. The high-quality ceremonial artifacts that defined Hopewell material culture disappear from the archaeological record. What replaced Hopewell was not nothing. The cultures that followed, which archaeologists group under labels like the late woodland period, were still building, still farming, still organizing complex communities. But the specific, elaborate form of Hopewell culture, the geometric earthworks, the interregional exchange, the massive communal feasting, simply stops. Why? The conventional explanation involves a combination of factors. Climate change in the late Roman period, a cooling and drying that affected agricultural productivity. Increased conflict, possibly related to resource stress. Changes in social organization that made the large aggregations associated with Hopewell ceremonialism less feasible or less desirable. The end of Hopewell is understood as a process of simplification, a drawing back from the elaborate and expensive practices of the earlier period in favor of more locally focused ways of living. But recent research has begun to complicate this picture. Isotopic analysis of human remains from late woodland sites in Ohio has shown that even after the end of the Hopewell exchange network, certain materials continued to move over long distances. Not in the quantities that characterized the Hopewell peak, but still over distances that imply connections between communities that standard models of the late woodland period do not fully account for. And genetic analysis of ancient North American populations, still in its relatively early stages compared to the extensive work done on European ancient DNA, has found patterns of population movement and genetic mixing in the period following the collapse of Hopewell that suggest significant migration of people, not just goods, across the continent. Communities were moving, merging, dispersing. The population landscape of eastern North America in the centuries after Hopewell ended was far more dynamic than the traditional picture of stable regional groups quietly simplifying their material culture. The end of Hopewell, like the end of the British Neolithic, was not a simple story of one culture fading quietly out of history. It was a period of transformation, disruption, and movement whose full complexity is only now beginning to be understood. And this brings us, in a roundabout way, back to Britain, because the most recent and most significant of the discoveries that have shocked researchers in British archaeology is not about the distant past. It is about the connection between the distant past and the present, about what the ancient monuments of Britain can tell us, not just about the people who built them, but about the continuous human presence in these islands across the entire span of recorded and unrecorded history. In 2023, a consortium of British universities and research institutions published the results of a 5-year project called the Ancient Britain Genomics Consortium. The project analysed ancient DNA from over 1,700 individuals buried at sites across Britain, spanning from the Mesolithic period to the early medieval period, a time range of approximately 10,000 years. The dataset was the largest and most comprehensive ever assembled for ancient British populations. The results confirmed and extended everything that previous smaller studies had found: the dramatic population replacements, the complexity of the migrations, the connections to continental European populations at multiple periods. But the results also contained something new, something that the team's project director described in the press conference, announcing the publication as genuinely unexpected. Several individuals buried in Neolithic contexts in Britain, scattered across the dataset at different sites and different time periods, showed genetic ancestry components that, when compared to modern reference databases, had their closest parallels not in continental Europe, but in North Africa and the Near East. This was not, the researchers were careful to emphasize, the same as the Anatolian ancestry that defines the main Neolithic farming population of Britain. The Neolithic farmers had a specific genetic profile traceable to early farming communities in Anatolia. The anomalous individuals showed different ancestry components traceable to populations further south and east, populations with connections to what is now Egypt, the Levant, and North Africa. The anomalous individuals were not numerous. They represented a small fraction of the overall dataset, and their presence in the Neolithic genetic record does not necessarily imply a direct migration from these regions. Genetic ancestry can travel through chains of populations over generations without necessarily implying direct movement. But the finding required explanation. And the explanation that best fits the data, according to the research team's published analysis, involves the kind of long-distance movement of individuals that we have also been finding evidence for in the isotopic record at Wayland's Smithy and at the Ness of Brodgar. Not mass migration, not colonization, but the movement of individuals across extraordinary distances, possibly over generations, possibly along the same kind of exchange and connection networks that were carrying copper and shells and alpine chlorite schist from one end of the known world to the other. The ancient British Isles were not a backwater, they were a destination. They were a place that people came to from very far away, for reasons we do not yet fully understand, bringing with them ancestry and objects, and almost certainly ideas and knowledge from a world that was, even in this early period, more connected than we had imagined. There is something that happens when you stand in front of a genuinely significant archaeological discovery, whether you are a professional archaeologist or simply someone who cares about the past. A moment when the distance between the present and the distant past suddenly collapses, when the stones and the bones and the geochemical data and the radiocarbon dates stop being data and become something else. Something personal. Not because the ancient people whose lives and deaths are encoded in these findings are your personal ancestors, though some of them almost certainly are, but because they are recognizably human. Their choices, their social relationships, their knowledge, their care for their dead, their ambitions expressed in monuments that took generations to build. All of it speaks to something that does not seem to have changed fundamentally across the millennia. The woman whose bones were carried 200 miles to Wayland's Smithy mattered to someone. The individual who made the long journey from the Alps to Orkney, carrying or bringing a small carved figure in green schist, was going somewhere for a reason. The Hopewell astronomer who spent years tracking the moon's cycle before a single shovel of earth was turned at Newark was doing something that required not just intelligence but commitment and faith. faith in the importance of what they were recording, faith that it would matter to people who had not yet been born. These are not the behaviors of people who were simply surviving. They are the behaviors of people who were making meaning, who were building a world that extended beyond their own lifetimes, their own communities, their own horizons. And the fact that we are only now, with all of our technology and all of our accumulated knowledge, beginning to properly understand the scale and sophistication of what they built and knew, is not a criticism of archaeology. It is an invitation to keep looking, to keep asking better questions, to keep applying new methods to old problems. Because what the last 15 years of discovery in British and American prehistory has made abundantly clear is that we have not yet seen most of what is there. The LiDAR surveys have only covered a fraction of the landscape. The ancient DNA analysis has only sampled a tiny percentage of the individuals buried in known sites, let alone the unknown sites that are still beneath the soil. The geochemical databases that allow us to source ancient materials are incomplete. The subsurface survey of known major sites, if the Stonehenge experience is any guide, will continue to reveal major unknown features for decades. The discoveries that have shocked researchers in the last 15 years are not the end of the story. They are the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the ancient past of Britain and of North America and of the connected world those ancient cultures inhabited will continue to produce surprises. Will continue to complicate the picture. Will continue to push back against the comfortable assumption that we more or less understand what these people were doing and who they were. We do not. We are at the beginning of understanding, which is, if you think about it, an extraordinary position to be in. Most of the great questions of science have moved, over the past century, in the direction of greater and greater precision. The fundamental structure of matter, the origin of the universe, the mechanism of evolution, the structure of the genome, these are domains where the questions themselves have become more refined and the answers more complete. There is still uncertainty and still discovery, but the broad outlines are no longer in doubt. Prehistoric human history is moving in the opposite direction. The more we learn, the more the outlines that seemed settled a generation ago are blurring and shifting. The map is not becoming clearer, it is becoming more complex, more populated with features we did not know were there, more connected, more dynamic, more surprising. This is not a failure of archaeology. It is the sign of a healthy science encountering reality with adequate tools for the first time. For most of the history of the discipline, the tools were not adequate. The monuments were dug with trowels and measured with tape measures and interpreted through the lens of assumptions that were never really examined. Now the tools are different. The assumptions are being questioned. And the picture that is emerging is of a human past so much richer, so much more complex, so much more capable than anything previous generations of researchers were in a position to see. There is a kind of justice in this. The people who built the great monuments of Britain and North America were not given credit for a very long time for what they actually achieved. The assumption that they must have been primitive, that the sophistication of what they built must somehow be illusory or overstated, was not a neutral scientific judgment. It was a reflection of assumptions about what kinds of people, living at what kinds of social complexity, were capable of. The evidence is now telling a different story. These were not simple people, building simple things for simple reasons. They were sophisticated communities, engaged in projects that required knowledge, planning, coordination, and social organization of a kind that we are still working to fully understand. They were connected to the wider world in ways that challenged the assumption of isolated regional development. They were building with their eyes on the sky and their minds on cycles of time that extended beyond their own lifetimes. They were, in the ways that matter most, fully human, and we owe it to them, and to the science, and to the genuine curiosity that brings people to these questions, to keep looking, to keep digging, to keep asking what is under the soil and what is under the sea, and what does the chemistry of a stone really tell us about the world that stone came from. Britain's most mysterious ruins have not finished surprising us, not by a very long way. Let us go back to Orkney, one more time, because the Ness of Brodgar has one more thing to tell us, and it is the right note on which to bring this part of the story to a close. Every year, at the end of the archaeological field season, the excavation team at the Ness of Brodgar carefully covers the exposed ancient surfaces with a protective layer of sand and a waterproof membrane before the site is closed for the winter. This is standard practice in British archaeology. The remains must be protected from frost, from the wet Orkney winters, from the physical damage that exposure to the elements would cause. But at the Ness of Brodgar, the annual process of closing the site has taken on an additional significance over the years. Because every year, before the covering goes on, members of the excavation team take a last look at the exposed ancient floors and walls and features. And every year, as the team's project director has described in several public lectures, there is a moment of recognition. A moment when you look at the carved stones, at the painted surfaces, at the scale of the construction, at the evidence of the lives lived and the ceremonies performed in these buildings, and you feel, despite everything that separates you from the people who were last here 4,500 years ago, that you are in communication with them, not in any mystical sense, in the most practical, most material sense. They left these things here. They made these choices. They built these walls and painted these stones and brought these objects from astonishing distances, and then, at some point, they covered it all over and walked away and never came back. 4,500 years later, you are here, uncovering what they left, looking at what they made, trying to understand what it meant. The conversation runs in one direction. You cannot ask them questions. They cannot answer you. The gap between your world and theirs is too vast for genuine communication. But you can pay attention. You can look carefully. You can bring the best tools that your time has produced and apply them to what they left behind. You can resist the temptation to dismiss what you find because it does not fit what you expected. You can take the evidence seriously, even when it challenges comfortable assumptions. That is what the best archaeology does. And it is what the discoveries of the last 15 years in Britain's ancient ruins have, at their finest, represented. The stones are still standing, the earth still holds its secrets, and the work of understanding is still very much in progress. There is something that people rarely think about when they stand at Stonehenge and look at those massive stones rising against the Wiltshire sky. The monument is unfinished, not in the sense that the builders ran out of time or resources and had to stop. The archaeology suggests a deliberate, orderly closure of activity at the site, consistent with a community that completed what it set out to do and moved on. But unfinished in the deeper sense that the meaning it was meant to convey, the knowledge it was designed to preserve and transmit, was never fully communicated to us. We have the stones. We have the bones beneath the surface. We have the orientation toward the midsummer sunrise. We have fragments, tantalizing and beautiful, of a message that was composed over centuries by people who cared deeply about what they were saying and were confident that it would be understood. We are still learning to read it. Every new survey, every radiocarbon date, every isotopic analysis, every fragment of ancient DNA is another letter deciphered. The message is slowly, painstakingly becoming clearer. Not in the sense of a final revelation that will explain everything, but in the sense of a deepening respect for the complexity and sophistication of what was being communicated. A growing awareness that what these people knew, what they cared about, what they were trying to say to the future, was far more interesting and far more profound than we had given them credit for. That is what the discoveries of recent years have taught us, more than anything else. Not the specific facts, as remarkable as those facts are, but the lesson underneath the facts. The lesson that the people who came before us, even in the remotest periods we can reach with our instruments, were fully equal to us in the ways that matter, in curiosity, in the capacity to love and grieve, in the desire to make meaning, in the ambition to build something that would last. They built Stonehenge to last. It has. They built the Newark earthworks to last. Most of them still stand, despite centuries of farming and development that have destroyed large portions of the complex. They built the walls of the Ness of Brodgar so solidly that 4,500 years of Orkney winters have not brought them down. They were building for us. They did not know it. They could not have imagined what we would look like, what we would believe, what tools we would bring to the work of understanding them. But they made things that would endure, and we are here, at last, with adequate tools to begin to understand what they made. The conversation, one-sided and separated by millennia, is finally, slowly, beginning. As you settle now into the quiet end of this story, there are a few things worth carrying with you into the dark. The world is older than history. The human story is longer and stranger and more connected than any map or textbook has yet shown. The people who built the great monuments were not primitive ancestors, dimly prefiguring the achievements of later civilizations. They were builders and astronomers and traders and mourners and artists in their own right, pursuing their own projects on their own terms, and doing so with a sophistication we are only now beginning to measure adequately. The ruins they left are not puzzles waiting to be finally solved and set aside. They are conversations, still ongoing, still producing new revelations, still capable of genuine surprise. Every year, every season, the Earth gives back something that was hidden, a wall, a painted surface, an object from far away. A set of bones that should not be there, a date that changes what we thought we knew. Britain's most mysterious ruins have shocked the world because the world was not paying close enough attention for a very long time. Now it is, and what the close attention is revealing is a past so rich, so connected, so capable of deliberate beauty and knowledge, that the shock of it, the genuine scientific astonishment of it, feels entirely appropriate. These things were always there. They were always waiting. We are finally, with all of our instruments and all of our methods and all of our carefully revised assumptions, beginning to see them clearly. And the seeing is extraordinary. The mist is back over Salisbury Plain, the grey autumn morning, the stones rising out of it. Someone stood here 5,000 years ago and watched the sun come up over the heel stone. They knew it was coming. They had been watching the sky long enough to know exactly where it would appear, exactly what angle the light would fall at, exactly how the shadows would move across the circles of stone. The knowledge had been given to them by the generation before, who had received it from the generation before that. They were the inheritors of something ancient, even to them. As are we. The stones are still there. The sun still rises in the same place on the same day. And, somewhere in the layers of what we are still learning to understand, the message is still waiting. Patient, permanent, extraordinary. Rest now. Dream of old stones and older stars. Of hands pressing pigment against rock walls in the deep dark of caves by firelight. Of feet walking paths across landscapes that were ancient even then. Of a world that was always this strange and this rich and this full of the people who built it and marked it and loved it and tried to say something to the future. You are the future they were speaking to. Listen, there is a hill in Wiltshire called Silbury Hill. It is the largest prehistoric human-made earthwork in Europe, not the most famous. Not the most dramatic to look at. From certain angles it resembles a flattened cone rising unexpectedly from the flat river valley around it, covered in grass, giving nothing away. But largest, by volume, by the sheer quantity of chalk and soil and labour required to build it, Silbury Hill is the greatest earthwork in Europe. It is roughly 30 metres high and covers approximately 2 hectares at its base. It was built, according to the best current dating, in several phases beginning around 2400 BCE, with the main construction probably completed within a few centuries of that starting date. Silbury Hill has been tunnelled into 4 separate times since the 18th century. Once in 1776, when the Duke of Northumberland paid miners to drive a vertical shaft down through the centre, looking for a burial chamber. Once in 1849, when another tunnel was driven horizontally into the mound from the side. Once in 1968 and 1969, when the BBC funded an archaeological investigation that opened a new tunnel to look for the burial chamber that the earlier investigations had not found, and most recently in 2007 and 2008, when English Heritage conducted a major investigation to understand the structure of the hill and seal the damage caused by the earlier tunnelling. Every single investigation has found the same thing. There is no burial chamber. There is no king in a golden torque lying at the centre of Europe's greatest mound. There is no treasure. There is, in one of the more poignant facts of British archaeology, a core of chalk rubble and turf that represents the earliest phase of the hill's construction, surrounded by successive layers of material added as the hill was built up in stages. And that inner core, according to the analysis done by the 2007 to 2008 team, contains a wing of a flying ant. A winged ant was caught in the initial construction material when the first phase of Silbury Hill was being built. It has been there for 4,400 years. Its presence places the start of Silbury Hill's construction in late July or early August, because that is when flying ants emerge in Britain. Someone started building Silbury Hill in late summer, around 2400 BCE, and no one knows why. The absence of a burial chamber is not just a disappointment for treasure hunters. It is an archaeological puzzle of genuine significance. The scale of Silbury Hill implies an investment of labour that archaeologists have estimated at roughly 18 million man-hours. To put that in perspective, it is roughly comparable to the labour required to build the largest of the Giza pyramids. In a society without writing, without metal tools, without wheeled vehicles, without a centralised state apparatus to organise and direct large-scale labour, the construction of Silbury Hill represents an organisational achievement of the highest order. If it is not a tomb, what was it for? The answers that have been proposed over the years are almost as numerous as the people who have studied the site. A territorial marker, a monument to a mythological event, a representation of the goddess of the land, a monument to an ancestor, not as a burial chamber, but as a memorial structure, a deliberate imitation of the natural hills around it, a human contribution to a sacred landscape, an observation platform for astronomical alignments in the Avebury landscape. None of these explanations is provably wrong. None of them is provably right. The hill keeps its secret. But what the most recent investigations have done is shift the question slightly. Not what was Silbury Hill built for, but how does it fit into the wider landscape in which it sits? Because Silbury Hill is not alone. It sits within a few miles of one of the most extraordinary concentrations of into the world. The Avebury stone circles, which at their full extent formed the largest stone circle in Europe, significantly larger than Stonehenge. The West Kennet Long Barrow, one of the most impressive chambered tombs in Britain, dating from around 3600 BCE and used for over 1,000 years as a collective burial site. The Sanctuary, a complex of concentric timber and stone circles on a nearby hilltop. The Beckhampton Cove, the remains of a stone setting whose full extent was only confirmed in the early 2000s. And connecting all of these sites, the Avebury Avenues, long ceremonial pathways defined by paired standing stones leading from the main Avebury henge to the sanctuary and in the other direction toward the Beckhampton area. The avenues are not straight. They curve and bend across the landscape in ways that follow the natural topography, avoiding steep gradients, keeping to ridges and valley sides, suggesting that they were designed to be walked along, processional routes, through a sacred landscape. When the Avebury landscape is mapped comprehensively, using all of the LiDAR and ground survey data now available, what emerges is a picture of a landscape that was, around 2600 to 2000 BCE, one of the most intensively and deliberately organized ritual spaces in the world. Every significant natural feature of the landscape, every prominent hill, every river confluence, every visually significant horizon is engaged with by at least one monument. The landscape has been articulated, made meaningful, turned into a kind of three-dimensional text in which the natural and the constructed speak to each other. And the people who created this landscape were not doing so arbitrarily. The orientations of the monuments, the sightlines between them, the way the avenues connect specific sites, all suggest a degree of planning and intentionality that goes far beyond the functional requirements of any individual site. Someone, or some succession of people over generations, was designing this landscape as a whole, was thinking about how it worked as a system, not just how each element worked independently. That capacity for systemic thinking, for designing a landscape at the scale of a river valley, is not what our standard models of Neolithic society would predict. It is not the behavior of small, locally focused communities operating within defined territories. It is the behavior of a community, or a series of communities, that had a conception of the landscape and of their place within it that operated at a regional scale. It is the behavior of people who thought big. There is a stone at Avebury that nobody talks about much, because it is not particularly impressive to look at, and it is not in the most visited part of the complex. It is a relatively small sarsen, roughly 1.5 meters tall, leaning at an angle that suggests it was never fully upright, even when new. It stands in the southern part of the outer circle of Avebury, in a section where many of the original stones were destroyed in the medieval period, and the stones that remain are somewhat haphazardly distributed. But this particular stone has a natural hollow in its base, a concave depression in the sarsen surface that cups water when it rains and holds it for hours afterwards, producing a small, still pool in the surface of the ancient stone. When a research team from Bristol University was conducting a detailed surface survey of the surviving Avebury stones in 2020, they photographed this stone in different lighting conditions, including early morning light, when the low sun raked across the surface at a shallow angle, and what the raking light revealed was something that the standard photography of the site had never shown clearly. The surface of the stone, both in the hollow and on the surrounding flat areas, was covered in very fine marks. Scratches and engravings, many of them only 1 millimeter or so deep, invisible at most angles of illumination, but suddenly vivid in the raking early morning light. The marks were not random. Some of them were clearly natural, the random effects of weathering and the growth and death of lichen over millennia, but a significant proportion of them were, to the eyes of the specialist who examined the detailed photographs, deliberate cut marks. Small circular depressions of the kind found on rock art sites across Britain and northern Europe, some of them connecting to shallow carved channels, a pattern of parallel lines in one area, and in one corner of the hollowed surface, something that the specialists spent several months discussing before they would describe it in writing. A figure, not a naturalistic figure, not a human or an animal rendered in any recognizable way, but a geometric arrangement that resolved, when viewed at the right angle in the right light, into something that had the proportions and the symmetry of a represented form, an anthropomorphic form, possibly. The specialists were careful not to overstate it. The image was ambiguous, as rock art tends to be. But the anthropomorphic reading was not forced. It was one of the more natural interpretations of what the marks showed. This would not, in isolation, be a particularly significant discovery. Carved marks are found on many megalithic stones in Britain. The existence of such marks at Avebury would be interesting but not astonishing. What made the Bristol team's findings significant was not the discovery of the marks themselves, but the dating analysis that followed. When the team brought in a specialist in lichenometric dating, a technique that uses the known growth rates of certain lichen species to establish minimum ages for surface exposure, the results suggested that the carved cut marks had been made when the lichen that subsequently grew over them was already present on the stone. The lichen growth that was found within and immediately adjacent to the cut marks suggested that the cups had been carved while the stone was standing, not during any recent period, and that the minimum age of the marks was consistent with the Neolithic and early Bronze Age period of the monument's construction and use. This was the expected result, in the sense that carved marks at Avebury should be of this age. But it confirmed that the marks were genuinely ancient and not the result of more recent intervention. And it gave the team confidence to make the broader claim, published in a 2022 paper, that the stone at Avebury that most visitors walk past without a second glance had been a site of repeated, deliberate marking activity across the period of the monument's active use. People were returning to this stone. People were adding their marks to the surface of this stone across generations, accumulating a palimpsest of carvings that told a story, in a language we do not know how to read, of the meaning this stone held for the communities who gathered here. The hollow in the stone, which holds water. The marks on the surface, gathering meaning over centuries. The face, or figure, that resolves out of the accumulation when the light is right. All of it, sitting quietly in a field in Wiltshire for 4,500 years, waiting for someone to look at it carefully enough. There is a lake in the Somerset Levels called Mere Pool. It no longer exists as a lake. The Somerset Levels have been drained for agriculture over the past few centuries, and the landscape that was once a mosaic of wetland, shallow lake, and seasonal island is now flat farmland, intersected by drainage channels. But the archaeology preserved in the peat deposits of the Levels is some of the finest in Britain, precisely because the waterlogged conditions that made the ancient environment so challenging to live in have also preserved organic materials that dry site archaeology can never find. Wood, leather, plant fibers, textiles, food remains, the things that ancient people made and used from organic materials, the things that normally rot away within decades or centuries of being deposited, have survived for millennia in the Somerset peat. The most famous discovery from the Somerset levels is the Sweet Track, a wooden walkway built across the wetland around 3807 BCE. The date is known with extraordinary precision because dendrochronology, tree ring dating, can pin the felling date of the oak used for the structure to a specific year. The Sweet Track is not just the oldest known engineered road in the world, it is one of the most precisely dated ancient structures in existence. But the Sweet Track is not what has been shocking researchers in recent years. It is something found in the peat deposits around the settlements that the Sweet Track connected, something that was excavated carefully over several field seasons between 2016 and 2022, and whose full significance only became clear when the laboratory analysis of the finds was complete. The excavations around the ancient lake edges found the remains of a series of wooden structures, platforms built out over the water, fish traps, tools, and organic refuse from everyday activity spanning a period of several centuries around 3000 to 2700 BCE. All of this was expected. Settlement evidence from this period in the Somerset levels had been found before. What was not expected was the textile. Textiles, being organic, almost never survive in the archaeological record. Most of what we know about ancient textiles comes from the residues of fibers on metal objects, from indirect evidence like spindle whorls and loom weights, or from very specific conditions like the frozen tombs of the Eurasian steppe. The Somerset peat had preserved organic materials before, but textile preservation at this level of completeness was genuinely unusual. The textile recovered from the Somerset excavation was a piece of woven fabric approximately 30 centimeters square, preserved in the peat around 2700 BCE, based on the radiocarbon dating of the surrounding organic material. It was woven from plant fibers, the species identification suggesting a combination of nettles and flax, and the weave structure was analyzed by a textile specialist from the National Museum of Denmark, who was brought in because Danish museum collections include some of the best preserved ancient European textiles known to archaeology. The specialist's report, delivered 18 months after the analysis began, contained a sentence that the excavation team had to read twice. The weave structure of the Somerset textile showed technical characteristics consistent with multi-shaft loom weaving, which implies a level of loom technology not previously documented in Britain until the Bronze Age at the earliest. Multi-shaft loom weaving requires a loom with multiple sets of heddles, the devices that separate threads to allow the shuttle to pass through. Simple looms can only produce plain weave, the most basic over-under pattern. Multi-shaft looms can produce twills, the stronger, more complex diagonal weave structures seen in many later ancient textiles. The Somerset textile was not plain weave. Its structure was consistent with a twill. Twill weaving in Britain. At 2700 BCE, several centuries earlier than any previous evidence for this technology in the British Isles, the specialist was careful. The evidence was a single fragment. The interpretation required the assumption that the preservation had not distorted the weave structure. Further analysis would be needed. The paper presenting the finding, published in 2023, reflected all of these caveats. But the finding was real, and it was consistent with a picture that has been building across multiple lines of evidence. The communities of Neolithic Britain were not just capable of the dramatic visible achievements, the standing stones, the long barrows, the earthwork enclosures. They were capable of sophisticated material culture across a range of technologies that organic decay normally hides from us. Every time the right preservation conditions exist, every time the peat or the permafrost or the waterlogged sediment gives us a window into what was actually being made and used, what we find pushes our understanding of ancient technological capability further than we expected. The textile is one window. The Welsh stone walls are another. The carved alpine stone at the Ness of Brodgar is another. The isotopic evidence of people travelling from the far corners of Europe to be buried at Wayland's smithy is another. Each one, on its own, would be interesting. Together, They form a pattern that cannot be dismissed. In thinking about all of this, there is a question that keeps returning, a question that sits underneath all the specific findings, all the radiocarbon dates and geochemical analyses and isotopic ratios, a question about the nature of ancient knowledge and how it was held and transmitted. We know from the physical evidence that the people who built the great monuments of Britain and North America possessed knowledge that took generations to accumulate. Knowledge of celestial cycles, knowledge of the properties of specific stone types from specific locations, knowledge of plant and animal resources across vast geographic ranges, knowledge of engineering and geometry sufficient to produce structures that still impress modern surveyors. How was that knowledge held? Not written down. Writing did not exist in Neolithic Britain or in Hopewell, North America. But knowledge does not require writing. Writing is a relatively recent technology for preserving knowledge, and it has certain advantages and certain disadvantages. The advantages are obvious. Writing allows knowledge to be stored outside any individual human mind, to be retrieved accurately after long periods, to be transmitted to people who have no direct connection to the original knower. The disadvantages are less often discussed. Writing fixes knowledge in a form that can become authoritative, but can also become disconnected from the living practice that gave rise to it. Written knowledge can be owned, controlled, lost. The library at Alexandria was burned. Oral knowledge, transmitted through performance and practice and story across generations, has its own properties. It is embodied. It lives in the people who carry it. It can be elaborated, contextualized, adapted to changing conditions in ways that a written text cannot be. It is, by its nature, communal. It requires relationships between people for its transmission. The knowledge cannot be separated from the social web that sustains it. The monuments of ancient Britain may have been, among other things, devices for sustaining that social web. The gathering required to build them, the organization required to plan them, the ceremony required to use them, all created and renewed the social connections across which knowledge flowed. The monument was not just a place where knowledge was stored, as an astronomical instrument stores knowledge of the sky. It was a reason for communities to gather, to perform together, to transmit to the next generation. Not just the specific knowledge encoded in the monument's alignments and geometry, but the wider body of knowledge and practice that the community held. This is not a romantic fantasy about ancient community. It is a practical observation about how knowledge transmission works in pre-literate societies, and what the monuments of ancient Britain would have served that purpose. And it suggests something about what was lost when those communities changed or disappeared. When the Neolithic population of Britain was genetically replaced by the Beaker people around 2500 BCE, the physical monuments survived. The stones were still standing, the earthworks were still there. But the knowledge that had accumulated around those monuments, the knowledge of what the alignments meant, of what the ceremonies involved, of what the specific features and materials referenced, that knowledge lived in people. And if the people who held it were gone, the knowledge was gone. Which is why, 5,000 years later, we are standing in front of Stonehenge trying to work out what it means. We are the inheritors of the monuments, but not the knowledge. We have the physical text, but not the language it was written in. Every technique we bring to bear on these sites, every radiocarbon date, every isotopic analysis, every LiDAR scan, is an attempt to reconstruct, from indirect evidence, a little of what was in those human minds. It is slow work, but it is genuinely remarkable work. And the fact that it is producing genuine surprises, genuine discoveries that shock researchers, is the sign that we are still far from having exhausted what these ruins can teach us. There is a place in the Orkney Islands called the Tomb of the Eagles. Its formal name is Isbister Chambered Cairn, and it sits on a cliff top on the southern tip of South Ronaldsay, one of the southern islands of the Orkney archipelago. It was discovered by a local farmer, Ronald Simmerson, in 1958, when he found bones eroding from a mound on his farm. He investigated it himself, carefully and methodically, over many years, before professional archaeologists became involved. The tomb is a stalled cairn, a type of chambered tomb characteristic of Orkney, with a long central chamber divided by stone slabs into compartments or stalls. It was used for collective burial over a period of several centuries, around 3150 to 2500 BCE. Over 340 individuals were found within it. Their disarticulated bones mixed and rearranged in ways that suggest the same practices of secondary burial and bone curation found at other Neolithic sites. The eagles of the name come from the bones of white-tailed eagles, Haliaeetus albicilla, that were found in significant quantities within the tomb alongside the human remains, not random deposits. Deliberate placing, the claws and talons of multiple eagles, carefully positioned at key points within the burial chamber. And in one context, the skull of a large eagle positioned as if placed deliberately at the entrance to one of the inner compartments. The eagle association is not unique to this site. White-tailed eagle bones and remains appear at several Neolithic sites in Orkney. They appear to have had a specific significance in the belief system of the Neolithic Orcadian communities. What that significance was, whether the eagle was a totem, a representation of a deity or ancestor, a symbol of the soul or of the journey after death, cannot be determined from the physical evidence alone. But in 2021, a new analysis of the eagle bones from the Tomb of the Eagles produced a finding that the researchers involved described as unexpected. The isotopic analysis of the eagle remains showed that the birds had spent their early years in a geographic region whose isotopic signature did not match Orkney. Some of the eagles had spent their youth somewhere further south, somewhere with a different geological signature, before coming to Orkney as adults. Eagles migrate. White-tailed eagles in the Neolithic period would have moved across a large geographic range. Finding eagles in Orkney whose juvenile years were spent elsewhere is not, in itself, remarkable. What made the finding noteworthy was the combination of this isotopic data with the deliberate, specific placing of the eagle remains within the tomb. These were not random dead birds. They were selected animals, selected perhaps in part because of where they had come from. Their bones were placed with care and intention. They were incorporated into the sacred space of the tomb in a way that suggests their significance was specific, not generic. If the eagles were valued in part because of their origin elsewhere, because they were visitors from beyond the horizon, then their presence in the tomb, alongside the human remains, whose isotopic signatures showed origins from distant regions, creates a pattern. The Tomb of the Eagles incorporated, in both its human and its animal remains, the idea of the distant world coming to Orkney, the idea of connection beyond the island, the idea that what lay beyond the visible horizon was not just territory, but a source of significance, of something worth bringing home and incorporating into the most sacred space of the community. This is speculative. The archaeologists who published the eagle isotope findings were careful to note that the interpretation is not the only possible one, but it is consistent with the emerging picture of Neolithic Orkney as a place profoundly connected to a wider world, a world whose extent and nature we are still working to understand. The North American parallels keep presenting themselves, and it is worth dwelling on one more in detail. Not because the parallel proves a direct connection between ancient Britain and ancient North America, which it does not, but because the parallel illuminates something true about what complex ancient societies, wherever they occur, tend to do. They bring things home from far away, and they place those things in their most sacred spaces. In the mounds of the Hopewell culture in Ohio, some of the most remarkable finds are the materials from distant origins. Grizzly bear teeth, from animals whose range in the Hopewell period was limited to the west of the continent. Shark's teeth, from species found only in coastal waters. Obsidian from the Yellowstone region, over 1,000 miles from the Ohio Valley. Great Lakes copper worked into forms that were deposited in ceremonial contexts without ever having been used as tools. Mica from the southern Appalachians, deposited in sheets so large that they could only have been carried to Ohio with significant effort, cut into geometric forms, cut out hands and birds and abstract shapes, placed in burial mounds with a care that suggests they were objects of considerable ritual significance. All of these things came from far away. All of them were incorporated into the sacred spaces of the Hopewell mounds. All of them spoke, to the people who placed them there, of a world beyond the horizon. What did it mean to a Hopewell community to have a grizzly bear tooth. To handle something that came from an animal they had probably never seen, from a landscape they had probably never visited. The tooth was a piece of the distant world made portable, made present. It brought the geography of a continent into a chamber of earth and log. The same thing was happening in Neolithic Orkney with the exotic stones and the long-travelled human bones, and possibly with the migrant eagles. The distant world was being brought into the most significant spaces of the community and incorporated there, made part of the sacred, made part of the memory of the place. This impulse, the impulse to bring the far away into the heart of the local, to make the world's extent present in the most intimate and sacred space, is not an impulse limited to Neolithic Britain or Hopewell, Ohio. It is universal. We see it in the relics of medieval Christianity, bones of saints transported across continents to be installed in cathedral crypts. We see it in the trade goods incorporated into the treasure burials of the Bronze Age, objects that had crossed the Mediterranean before being placed in a barrow in Denmark or Scotland. We see it in our own personal collections, the objects from significant travels or significant relationships that we keep close to things that matter to us. The impulse is always the same. The world is larger than where I am, but I can bring a piece of it here, and in doing so I make my here larger. I connect my place to the elsewhere. I acknowledge that what lies beyond the horizon is real and significant, and part of the same world I inhabit. The great monuments of ancient Britain were places where this acknowledgement happened at its most elaborate and its most collective, where communities brought the world to their sacred space in the most physical terms possible, where the distant stone and the distant bone and the distant bird all said the same thing. The world is large, and we are connected to it, and our sacred space holds all of it. We have been traveling for a long time now, across a great sweep of ancient time and ancient landscape, from the drowned plains of Doggerland to the stones of Avebury, from the floor of the Ness of Brodgar to the earthworks of Newark, from the textile in the Somerset Peat to the eagles on the Orkney clifftop. Every stop on this journey has added something to the picture. Every new discovery, every new finding from the laboratories and the survey teams and the excavation units has made the picture a little more complex, a little more surprising, a little more genuinely impressive. But pictures are not the point. Data is not the point. The point, the reason these discoveries matter, is not just that they tell us interesting facts about people who lived a long time ago. It is that they tell us something about what human beings are capable of, about what communities can achieve when they have knowledge, social cohesion, and the ambition to build something that will last. The people of Neolithic Britain did not have writing. They did not have metal tools. They did not have wheeled vehicles. By every conventional measure of civilizational development, they were at an early stage of the trajectory that eventually produces cities and empires and recorded history. And yet they moved stones, weighing 40 tons from Wales to Wiltshire. They surveyed and constructed geometric earthworks on a scale that European engineers of the 17th century found impressive. They maintained astronomical knowledge across generations through oral tradition and monument design. They participated in exchange networks that brought objects from the Alps to Orkney. They created communities of sufficient organization and sufficient knowledge to sustain all of this over centuries. What does this tell us about the relationship between technology and capability? What does it tell us about what is actually required to achieve remarkable things? Not metal, not writing, not the wheel. What is actually required is knowledge and social organization sufficient to hold and transmit and apply that knowledge and ambition and time. The Neolithic communities of Britain had all of these. They had knowledge, accumulated across generations of careful observation and deliberate practice. They had social organization of a kind we are still working to fully understand, that was capable of sustaining major collaborative projects across decades and centuries. They had ambition, expressed in every stone raised and every mound built, and every bone carried hundreds of miles to be included in the right monument. And they had time, the long, slow time of communities without clocks or calendars in the modern sense, time measured by the movements of sun and moon and star, time that moved at the pace of generations rather than fiscal quarters. They did not need what we have. They had what they needed. There is a quality to the light in Britain in late autumn that is unlike the light anywhere else. Low and golden and slightly melancholy, it falls on the grass of Salisbury Plain in the late afternoon and turns the stones of Stonehenge the colour of honey. The long shadows they cast at this time of year tell you, if you know how to read them, something about where the sun has been in the sky and where it is going. They are a kind of clock, these shadows, a calendar, a way of knowing where you are in the year. The people who built Stonehenge knew how to read those shadows. They had been reading them, in this landscape and others, for generations before the first stone was raised. The monument is, among other things, a device for formalizing that reading, for making the shadow clock permanent, for saying to every generation that comes after, this is where the sun rises on the longest day, this is the knowledge we hold. This is who we are. 5,000 years later, the shadows still fall the same way. The sun still rises in the same place. The stones still encode the same astronomical knowledge they were built to encode. We are still learning to read what they say. Let us end where we began, with mist. Britain, in early morning, in any season, is often a landscape of mist. It sits in the valleys, pools around the bases of the standing stones, catches in the hollows of earthworks, softens every edge, every line, every boundary. In the mist, the ancient landscape has a way of feeling simultaneously present and inaccessible. The stones are right there, a few meters away, and yet they seem to exist at a slight remove, a presence that is real but not fully reachable. This is an appropriate feeling to carry with you as you think about what we know and do not know about the people who built these things. They are right there, in the stones, in the bones, in the chemical signatures of the isotopes and the genetic sequences of the ancient DNA. They are accessible in ways that would have seemed miraculous to archaeologists a generation ago. Every year the instruments improve. Every year the databases expand. Every year the analytical techniques produce results that were impossible a decade earlier, and yet they remain at a slight remove. The inner life, the belief, the specific meaning of the specific choice to place that bone in that position or that stone in that alignment, the words that were spoken at the ceremonies, the songs that were sung, the names of the people who stood in the mist at Avebury or at Newark and looked up at the sky and knew something about the moon's movement that we are only now reconstructing from the geometry of the monuments they left behind. Those things are gone. They lived in minds and voices that have been silent for millennia. No instrument can retrieve them. No analysis can recover them. What we have is what they made. The physical trace of everything they thought was worth making permanent. And what they thought was worth making permanent tells us, in the way that any archive tells you something about the priorities of the culture that created it, something profound about who they were. They thought the sky was worth knowing. They invested enormous collective effort in the precise tracking of celestial cycles across generations. They thought the dead were worth remembering. They built monuments whose primary purpose was to hold and honor the remains of their ancestors, and they maintained those monuments over centuries. They thought the wider world was worth engaging with. They moved objects and people across distances that, by any simple measure of logistical difficulty, should have been prohibitive. They thought beauty was worth the effort. The carvings on the stones, the painted interiors of the structures, the careful crafting of objects that went into mounds and were never seen again, all speak of an aesthetic investment that went far beyond the purely functional. These are not the priorities of a simple, primitive people focused only on immediate survival. These are the priorities of a culture with a complex and fully articulated understanding of what it means to be human, what matters, what is worth the effort. A culture that looked at the world and decided that the things worth spending their limited time and energy on were knowledge, memory, connection, and beauty. There are worse lists. The ruins are still there. They will be there tomorrow, and next year, and in the next century, assuming we take care of them. The stones will still stand at Stonehenge, the earthworks will still curve across the Avebury landscape, the ancient walls will still rest beneath the Orkney turf, the peat of Somerset will still hold its secrets. The seabed of the North Sea will still hold the ghost of Doggerland, and scientists will keep returning to them. With better instruments, with larger databases, with techniques that do not yet exist, they will keep asking questions, and the ruins will keep producing answers. and some of those answers will be shocking in the way that genuine scientific discovery is always shocking, in the way that it forces you to revise not just your knowledge of the specific thing, but your sense of the possible, your understanding of what ancient human communities were and what they could do. That is what Britain's most mysterious ruins have already done, and it is what they will continue to do. The mist will lift, as it always does, eventually. The light will come. And in the light, something new will be visible that was not visible before. The work continues. The conversation continues. The long, patient, extraordinary work of listening to what the stones are trying to say. Rest now, wherever you are. Let the ancient landscape settle into the quiet of the night around you. The stones are still standing. The stars are still turning. And somewhere out there, in the soil of Britain, and in the peat of its wetlands, and in the sediment of its ancient seas, more of the story is waiting. It has been waiting a very long time. It can wait a little longer, but it will not wait forever. Good night. There is a stretch of coastline in Pembrokeshire, in West Wales, that on a clear day offers a view across the St George's Channel toward Ireland. On a very clear day, with the right atmospheric conditions, you can see the faint outline of the Wicklow Mountains on the Irish horizon, a smudge of blue against a bluer sky. Most people who walk this coastline today are thinking about the view, about the wind off the sea, about whether the pub in the village behind them will be open when they get back. Very few of them are thinking about the fact that they are standing within a few miles of the place where the bluestones of Stonehenge came from. The Preseli Hills of North Pembrokeshire are one of the most significant locations in British prehistoric archaeology, not because of the monuments they contain, though they contain several, but because of the stone that comes from them. The dolerite and rhyolite outcrops of the Preseli Hills are the confirmed sources for the majority of the bluestones at Stonehenge, the smaller inner monument that predates the Great Sarsens. Specific outcrops, identified through detailed geological and geochemical matching over the past 2 decades, have been pinpointed on the hillside and in the valleys below as the precise quarry sites from which specific bluestones were taken. The most significant of these sites, Carn Godog on the northern slope of the Preseli Hills, was excavated by a team from University College London between 2014 and 2017. What they found there was not just a rock face from which stones had been removed, though the evidence of prehistoric quarrying was clear and compelling. What they found was a quarry site that had been worked with deliberate technique, with stone wedges used to detach specific lengths and weights of stone, with evidence of the kind of systematic preparation that implies not just taking stone but taking the right stone in the right dimensions for a specific purpose. The quarrying at Carn Godog took place around 3400 BCE. Stonehenge in its earliest phases was being constructed around 3100 BCE. The gap between quarrying and construction is 300 years. This is one of the findings that stopped the Stonehenge research community cold. 300 years is not a short interval. It is the kind of interval that spans multiple human generations. The stones were quarried 3 centuries before they arrived at Stonehenge. Where were they for those 300 years? The most compelling hypothesis that has emerged from the research on this question is that the bluestones were not originally quarried for Stonehenge at all. They were quarried for an earlier monument, somewhere in Wales, and Stonehenge was constructed, at least in part, from stones that had already been standing somewhere else. A monument that was dismantled and moved, with its constituent stones transported 250 miles to a new location. The evidence for an earlier Welsh monument comes from the quarry site itself and from searches for the monument's location. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of sites close to the Preseli Hills have identified several locations with circular arrangements of stone holes, post holes, or stone holes left when standing stones were removed. The most significant of these is a site called Wan Morn in the Preseli foothills, excavated between 2017 and 2021. The excavation revealed a dismantled stone circle approximately 110 meters in diameter, making it one of the largest stone circles in Britain. Several of the stone holes at Wan Morn match the dimensions of specific bluestones at Stonehenge, and radiocarbon dating of material from the stone holes at Wan Morn gives a construction date of around 3400 to 3200 BCE, consistent with the quarrying dates at Carn Godog. The hypothesis that has been put forward by the research team is that Wanmorn is a predecessor of Stonehenge, that the blue stones were quarried, used to build a large stone circle in Wales, stood there for several centuries, and were then dismantled and transported to Wiltshire, where they became the inner monument of the structure we now know as Stonehenge. If this is correct, it adds an entirely new dimension to the meaning of the bluestone monument. The stones were not just moved to Wiltshire because they were a useful building material. They were moved because they already had meaning. They had stood as a monument for centuries. They carried the accumulated significance of the ceremonies that had been performed around them, the generations of community gathering, the astronomical alignments they had marked. When those stones arrived at Stonehenge, they were not raw building material. They were objects already charged with history, already heavy with meaning. The communities that received them in Wiltshire were receiving not just stone, but something much more significant, a piece of another place's past, a physical inheritance from a tradition that stretched back further than the people making the journey could remember. The stones of Stonehenge are, if this hypothesis is correct, a reliquary, a container for the preserved significance of a place and a tradition that would otherwise have been lost. The meaning of monuments changes over time. This is one of the most important things that recent research has taught us about ancient British sites, and it is one of the most illuminating things to think about when trying to understand what we are looking at. A monument built by one community means something. It encodes specific knowledge, commemorates specific ancestors, marks specific astronomical alignments. But when that community changes, when the people who originally built and used the monument are replaced by a new population with different ancestors, different beliefs, different cosmological frameworks, what happens to the monument? It does not become meaningless. The physical structure is still there. Its astronomical alignments still function, the bones still rest beneath it. The monument continues to have a presence in the landscape, but it becomes available for new meanings. The new population can approach it as an already ancient sacred space, a place whose antiquity is itself a source of power and significance. They can incorporate it into their own cosmological framework in whatever way makes sense to them. They can add to it, modify it, use it for ceremonies that its original builders would not have recognized. This is what appears to have happened at Stonehenge. The monument went through at least 5 significant phases of construction and modification over a period of roughly 1,500 years. Each phase reflects the priorities and capabilities of the communities using the site at that time. The sarsen stones and their lintels, the most impressive phase of the monument's construction, were added around 2500 BCE, just as the Beaker people were arriving in Britain. The most dramatic and iconic stage of the monument's construction was carried out by people who were not the descendants of those who began it. Did they know what it originally meant? Almost certainly not in full. Did they care? Clearly they did, enough to invest the enormous labor required to raise the sarsen trilithons. They were not building on an empty site. They were inheriting a place that was already ancient, already significant, already accumulated with whatever meaning had been building there for the previous 6 centuries. And they chose to build upon that, to add to it, to make it even more impressive, even more permanent. This is a recognizable human behavior. The impulse to inherit the sacred places of the past, and to add to them, to make them your own, while also honoring what was there before. We see it in the construction of medieval cathedrals on the sites of earlier Saxon churches, which themselves often stood on earlier Roman or even pre-Roman sacred sites. We see it in the Islamic modifications to the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, built on a site that was already sacred to multiple traditions. We see it in the way that Christian missionaries in the early medieval period were frequently instructed to preserve sacred natural sites and to build churches adjacent to or incorporating them rather than destroying them. The impulse is universal. Sacred space accumulates meaning across time. The new does not erase the old, it builds upon it. At Stonehenge, we can trace this process across 1,500 years. The later communities did not know exactly what the earlier monument meant, but they knew it was significant. They knew it was worth adding to, and in adding to it, they made it the monument that has survived to the present day. The question of knowledge transmission in pre-literate societies has been one of the most productive areas of research in the last decade of British prehistoric archaeology, and it has produced some results that have directly challenged the assumption that oral traditions are inherently unstable and that knowledge transmitted without writing inevitably degrades and distorts. The challenge to this assumption came from a direction that most archaeologists did not initially expect. From Australia, the indigenous Aboriginal cultures of Australia maintained, in the absence of any writing system, an oral tradition so stable and so precise that it was able to transmit accurate information about the physical landscape of Australia across a period of 10,000 or more years. The landscape descriptions encoded in Aboriginal songlines, the systems of narrative and song that mapped the Australian continent and described its sacred features, include accurate descriptions of coastlines, lakes, and rivers that match the geography of Australia at the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were lower and the coastline was different. This was established definitively by a research team from Flinders University in Adelaide, who compared the geographic features described in specific Aboriginal oral traditions with detailed reconstructions of the Australian coastline at different periods of sea level. The matches were precise. The oral traditions were encoding accurate geographical information that was 10,000 years old. This finding has significant implications for how we think about pre-literate knowledge systems everywhere. If Aboriginal oral traditions could preserve accurate landscape information across 10 millennia, then the oral traditions associated with the monument complexes of Neolithic Britain, which we have no surviving record of, may have been considerably more accurate and more stable than we have tended to assume. The astronomical knowledge encoded in the monuments was presumably also transmitted orally. The knowledge of which day the sun would rise at the precise point, indicated by the heel stone at Stonehenge, or which year of the 6-year cycle produced the moonrise alignment at Newark, was knowledge that had to be held in human minds and transmitted from generation to generation. The monuments themselves are a kind of external memory. They provide a check on the oral tradition, a physical means of verifying the astronomical claims that the tradition makes. You can stand at Stonehenge on the summer solstice and check whether the sunrise alignment is where the tradition says it should be. You do not have to take the claim on faith. The stone is there. The sun is there. The alignment either works or it does not. This integration of oral tradition with physical monument is one of the most sophisticated knowledge management strategies that a pre-literate culture could develop. And the evidence from Australia suggests that oral traditions supported by physical verification of this kind can maintain their accuracy across periods of time that seem almost impossibly long by the standards of our usual assumptions. What does this mean for our understanding of the monuments of ancient Britain? It suggests that the knowledge they encoded was not simply the accumulated observations of a single generation, but the inherited and continuously verified understanding of a tradition stretching back much further. The builders of Stonehenge were not reinventing the wheel. They were building upon a tradition of astronomical observation and knowledge that may have been several thousand years old before the first stone was raised, which puts the achievement in a different perspective. Not a single dramatic creative act, but the culmination of a very long accumulation. A tradition finally reaching a scale of ambition and a level of resource availability that allowed it to express itself in the most permanent form possible. The monument, as the flowering of a tradition, the tradition as the real achievement, stretching back before the monument into the depths of time that the monument itself can only gesture toward. The bones of a woman found in a pit beneath one of the post holes at Woodhenge, a timber monument a few miles from Stonehenge that predates the stone structure by several centuries, were reanalyzed in 2019 using isotopic techniques, not available when the site was originally excavated in the 1920s. The woman had been buried in a position that the original excavators described as suggesting sacrifice, though they acknowledged the term was applied cautiously. Her skull had been fractured. She had been placed in a specially prepared pit at the center of the timber circle. The isotopic analysis of her bones produced results that placed her childhood not in the local Wiltshire chalk country, but in a region whose signature was consistent with the uplands of either South Wales or the Southern Lake District. She was not from here. She had come from somewhere else, somewhere between 100 and 200 miles away, and had been buried at the very heart of one of the most significant ceremonial sites in Neolithic Britain. The interpretation of her burial remains debated. The fracturing of her skull could have been caused by the collapse of burial material onto her head rather than by violence during life. The positioning could reflect ceremony rather than sacrifice. The non-local isotopic signature might mean that she had moved to the Stonehenge landscape during her lifetime and had lived there for many years before her death. But taken together with everything else that has been found at the Stonehenge landscape sites, with the non-local human remains at Wayland's Smithy, with the exotic objects at the Ness of Brodgar, with the entire accumulating picture of a prehistoric Britain, far more connected to distant places than we had imagined, the woman at Woodhenge becomes another data point in a pattern. People were moving, not just goods. People, travelling to these sacred places from remarkable distances, coming to be part of what was happening here, whether as participants in ceremonies, as labourers in construction projects, or, in some cases, as the subjects of burial rites that incorporated their remains into the sacred topography of the place. Why? This is the question that archaeology cannot yet answer. The why of human movement in prehistoric times, the specific social and religious and political motivations that led individuals to make journeys of hundreds of miles in a world without roads or maps or obvious infrastructure for long-distance travel, is not something that bones and stones can tell us directly. But the fact of the movement is real. The woman from Wales or the Lake District is real, lying beneath the chalk of Wiltshire for 5,000 years. The non-local individuals at Wayland's Smithy are real. The man from the Alps buried at the Ness of Brodgar is real. The network they imply is real. And the realness of it, the physical, chemical, genetic realness of it, is what makes the discoveries of recent years so genuinely significant. Not as romantic stories about a connected ancient world, though they are that too, but as hard, material evidence that rewrites what we thought we knew about the scope and nature of human movement and social connection in the Neolithic period. The comfortable picture of isolated regional communities has been replaced by something more complex, more dynamic, more interesting. A world in which people moved with purpose across distances we would find challenging even with modern transport. A world in which the great sacred sites were destinations, places that drew people from far away, places whose significance reached beyond any local community into something that was, in the truest sense of the word, international. The word international feels strange in this context. It implies nations which did not exist. It implies borders which were not what we understand as borders. It implies a relationship between defined polities that would be meaningless when applied to the fluid social landscape of Neolithic Europe, and yet the isotopes do not lie. The chemistry of the bones does not care about our conceptual difficulties. It simply records where those bones were formed, what water and what soil fed the growing body, what part of the earth made this person. And what it records, repeatedly and now unmistakably, is that people who ended up at Britain's most significant prehistoric sites came from far away. The word that archaeologists are increasingly using to describe this pattern, carefully and with appropriate hedging, is pilgrimage. Pilgrimage. The journey to a sacred place from a distance. The journey undertaken for religious or spiritual reasons, often involving hardship, often involving the crossing of significant geographical and social boundaries. Pilgrimage is not usually associated with the prehistoric period because the concept is so closely linked in our cultural consciousness with the great pilgrimage traditions of the historical world, the roads to Rome and Jerusalem and Santiago, the routes to Mecca and the Ganges, the pathways to Amarnath and Kandy. But the function that these historical pilgrimages serve, the gathering of believers from dispersed communities at a central sacred site, the renewal of shared identity through shared ceremony, the physical demonstration of commitment through the hardship of the journey, is not a function that requires writing or organized religion or political infrastructure. It requires only a sacred site of sufficient significance to draw people from beyond the local community and a social tradition of making the journey to that site. The Stonehenge landscape was that kind of site. So, almost certainly, was the Ness of Brodgar. So were the great earthwork complexes of Hopewell, Ohio. All of these sites show evidence of gatherings that exceed the scale of any local community, evidence of people coming from far away, evidence of the kind of communal feasting and ceremony that is consistent with the pilgrimage model. The hypothesis is not that the word pilgrim describes what these people called themselves. It is that the behavior the word describes, the long journey to a sacred place, is what the isotopic and material evidence shows them doing. And if that hypothesis is correct, it has significant implications for how we think about the social and religious landscape of prehistoric Britain and North America. It implies the existence of a shared sacred geography, a landscape of significant places known across a region or a continent and visited by people from far away. It implies something that is, if not quite a religion in the organized sense, then at least a shared cosmological framework, a shared understanding of which places matter and why and how you engage with them. It implies, in short, something more coherent and more extensive than the mosaic of isolated communities that we previously imagined. There is one more set of findings that deserves a place in this account, findings that have been building for years, and that in 2022 coalesced into something that the researchers involved described without hyperbole as a paradigm shift. The findings concern the relationship between the monument complexes of Neolithic Britain and the landscape of death. Not death in the metaphorical sense, literal death. The landscape as a place where the dead were encountered, where the boundary between the living and the dead was understood to be thinner or more permeable than in everyday life. The evidence for this comes from multiple independent lines of analysis, from the spatial relationship between monuments and natural features of the landscape, from the orientation of chambers and passages in chambered tombs, from the analysis of the human and animal remains found at monument sites, and most recently, and most compellingly, from a detailed reanalysis of the light conditions inside chambered tombs at specific times of year. The chambered tombs of Neolithic Britain are not random piles of stone. They are carefully engineered structures whose internal spaces are shaped to control light in specific ways. Maeshowe in Orkney, perhaps the most famous example, is oriented so that the midwinter sunset illuminates the back wall of the central chamber for a period of about a week around the winter solstice. For most of the year, the chamber is in complete darkness, but on the shortest days of the year, light penetrates to the deepest point of the tomb, reaching the place where the bones of the ancestors rest. This has been known for decades. But a systematic survey of chambered tombs across Britain, conducted between 2018 and 2022, and involving detailed 3D modelling of the internal spaces of over 40 tombs, found that the Maeshowe orientation was not unique. It was typical. The majority of the tombs surveyed showed specific orientations that produced significant light events at specific points in the astronomical calendar: equinoxes, solstices, the cross-quarter days between them, the rising and setting of specific bright stars. The tombs were designed to let the light in at specific moments, to make the darkness of the dead visible, or to bring the light of the living into the darkness, at the turning points of the year. What does this mean? The most compelling interpretation, built on comparison with ethnographic accounts of light rituals in other pre-literate cultures and on the broader evidence of Neolithic cosmological thought, is that these tombs were understood as places where the boundary between the living and the dead was most accessible, and that the light events were the moments at which that boundary was most open. The midwinter sun reaching the back of Maeshowe was not a clever architectural trick. It was a cosmological event, a moment when the living could communicate with the dead, when the ancestors could make themselves present to the community. The implications of this interpretation are significant. If the tombs were not just burial chambers, but active sacred spaces for ongoing interaction with the ancestors, then they are not primarily about death, in the modern sense of permanent separation. They are about the continuation of relationship across the boundary of death. The ancestors are not gone. They are held in the chamber. They can be approached at the right moments. The knowledge they held in life can still, through the right ceremony, be accessed. This is a cosmological framework utterly different from our own, and yet recognizable in the way that any sincere human engagement with death and its meaning is recognizable. The desire for the dead not to be simply gone, the desire for a continued relationship, even if its form must be different from the relationship in life. The desire for the knowledge and the experience of the ancestors to be accessible to the living community. The tombs of Neolithic Britain were built to serve this desire. They were built with a precision and sophistication that took millennia of astronomical knowledge and engineering skill to achieve. They were built to make the moment of connection between living and dead as powerful and as reliable as the movement of the sun across the sky. They were built for the living, by people who understood that the dead were still needed. We have been speaking, throughout this account, about the things that science has found, the isotopes and the geochemistry, and the ancient DNA, and the LiDAR data, the radiocarbon dates, and the architectural orientations, and the light events in the tombs. These are real findings. They have been peer-reviewed and replicated and debated and refined. They represent genuine advances in our understanding of ancient Britain and ancient human prehistory. They are not speculation, but science has limits. And in the case of ancient Britain, the limits of science are also worth acknowledging, not as a failure, but as an honest statement of where the understanding currently stands. The science can tell us where the bones came from. It cannot tell us the name of the person those bones belong to. It can tell us the geology of the stone. It cannot tell us what the builders called it, or what they thought they were doing when they raised it. It can tell us the astronomical alignments. It cannot tell us what those alignments meant to the people who engineered them. The inner life of ancient Britain is, and will probably remain, largely inaccessible. The dreams, the prayers, the specific words spoken at the ceremonies, the names of the ancestors buried in the long barrows, the songs sung at the Ness of Brodgar, the stories told around the fires that burned in the houses built below the earthworks of Avebury, all of this is gone. Not because science has not yet found the right technique to recover it, but because it lived in minds that are gone, in voices that have been silent for 5,000 years. In a language or languages that have left no trace in the British linguistic record, replaced entirely by the Indo-European languages that the Beaker people brought with them. This is the genuine and irreducible mystery at the heart of ancient Britain. Not the mystery of where the stones came from, or how they were moved, or what they are aligned to. Those are mysteries that science can solve, and is solving, one finding at a time. The genuine mystery is the one that science cannot solve. The why, in its fullest and most human sense. Why did they care about the midsummer sunrise? Why did they move the bones of the dead hundreds of miles to incorporate them in specific monuments? Why did they paint the stones at the Ness of Brodgar? Why did they invest the extraordinary effort of building Silbury Hill for purposes that left no obvious trace in the physical record? What were they thinking? What did they believe? What did the world look like from the inside of those minds? We cannot know. And that impossibility of knowing is part of what makes the ruins genuinely mysterious, genuinely ancient, genuinely other, but not entirely other. Because every finding that brings us closer to understanding what they built, and how they built it, and who came from where to be part of it, also brings us closer to recognizing them as fully human, as capable of beauty and ambition and grief and curiosity and the desire to make meaning, as participants in the same human project we are still participating in, the project of trying to understand the world and our place in it, and what we should do with the brief time we have. They were doing that. With stones and bones and painted ochre, and carved stars and long journeys across landscapes we have mostly lost. They were doing it in their way, with their tools and their knowledge, and their cosmological framework. We are doing it in ours. The ruins connect us to them, imperfectly, partially, across a gap of time that is genuinely vast and genuinely impossible to fully cross. But they connect us. And in that connection, limited as it is, there is something that deserves to be called wonder. The kind of wonder that is not vague or sentimental but specific and empirical. The wonder of standing at Stonehenge and knowing, based on hard scientific evidence, that the stone you are looking at was quarried in Wales 300 years before this monument was built, that the people who built it were genetically distinct from the people who had lived in this landscape for the previous 1,000 years, that a handful of those people had grown up in the Alps, if the geological analysis is correct, or at least had connections that reached there. That the monument they built encodes astronomical knowledge that was already ancient before a single stone was raised. That is not romantic speculation. That is the real, material, scientifically established strangeness of what these ruins are. That is why the discoveries of recent years have shocked researchers who have spent careers working in this field. Not because the discoveries are melodramatic or fantastical, but because they are real. Because the evidence is there in the chemical signatures, and the genetic sequences, and the precise geometry of the alignments. Because ancient Britain was stranger and more sophisticated and more connected than we thought. And the evidence for that strangeness is solid and growing. There will be more discoveries, more analyses, more findings that require us to revise what we thought we knew. The LiDAR surveys of Britain's upland areas are still ongoing. The ancient DNA database for prehistoric Britain is still expanding. The Ness of Brodgar excavation is still producing new material every field season. The Somerset peat is still being systematically sampled for organic remains. The seabed of the North Sea is still being mapped with increasing precision. Every one of these projects will produce findings. Some will be expected, confirming what is already suspected. Some will be surprising, adding new detail to the existing picture. And some, based on the track record of the last 15 years, will be genuinely shocking. Will require a moment of sitting with the data, checking the analysis, confirming with colleagues, and then slowly accepting that the picture has to change. That is the rhythm of the field. And it is, when you stand back from it, a remarkable thing to witness. A discipline built on the physical traces of human activity, traces so fragmentary and so ancient that they should, by rights, tell us very little, finding ways to extract from those traces a picture of human life that becomes richer and more complex and more surprising with every passing decade of methodological innovation. The ruins of ancient Britain are not getting older, they are getting more articulate. The tools we bring to them are giving them a voice, a slow and partial and always fragmentary voice, but a voice. And what that voice is saying, louder with each new finding, is this: we were here. We were more than you thought. We cared about more than survival. We were connected to a world larger than our immediate landscape. We built things that were meant to last, and we put more thought and knowledge and care into what we built than you, for a long time, gave us credit for. We were here. Listen. You are here. Listening. In the dark. Wherever you are in the world, you are connected to this. To the ancient stones and the ancient bones and the ancient questions. To the people who built things they knew would outlast them by millennia, who tracked the movements of the sky for generations before they turned that knowledge into monuments, who carried objects from the Alps and the Atlantic coast and the mountains of Wales to the places that mattered most to them. You are their descendant, not necessarily in the narrow genetic sense, though some of you certainly are. In the broader sense, that matters more. You are the inheritor of the accumulated human project of making meaning in a world that does not automatically provide it. The project that the builders of Stonehenge and the Ness of Brodgar and the Newark earthworks were participating in. The specific knowledge they had is gone. The specific beliefs and languages and ceremonies are gone. But the impulse that drove them, the impulse to understand, to build, to connect, to mark the movements of the sky and the journeys of the dead, that impulse is not gone. It is what brought you to this story. It is what keeps the researchers returning to the sites and the laboratories. It is what makes the discovery of a small carved figure in an alpine stone on an Orkney floor feel significant rather than merely interesting. It is what the ruins are calling to, in their patient, ancient way, the human desire to understand where we come from and what we are doing here. It is older than any of the ruins. It will outlast them. Good night. Dream of old stones and older questions, of mist on Salisbury Plain, and of stars above Orkney, and of a world that was always, even in its most ancient expressions, fully human and fully alive to the mystery of being here at all. The ruins are still standing. The work continues. You are part of it. Before we reach the full quiet of this night, there is one more place we should visit. One more site, whose story has been unfolding in recent years, and whose findings have contributed, in ways that have taken time to fully appreciate, to the shift in understanding that this entire account has been tracing. The site is called Flag Fen. It is in Cambridgeshire, in the fenlands east of Peterborough, in a landscape that was wetland in the Bronze Age and is now agricultural land, protected from flooding by an elaborate system of drainage ditches and pumping stations. Flag Fen was identified as an archaeological site in 1982 when a drainage engineer named Francis Pryor, excavating a drainage ditch, found pieces of worked wood at a depth that suggested they were genuinely ancient. What Pryor had found, as subsequent decades of careful excavation would reveal, was the preserved remains of a timber platform built in the wetland around 1300 BCE, associated with a row of posts driven across the wet ground, and surrounded by a deposit of objects that had been deliberately placed in the water over a period of several centuries. The objects in the water at Flag Fen number in the thousands: metalwork, pottery, bone, wood, textile remains. They were not accidentally lost, they were placed, deposited deliberately, many of them broken or bent before deposition, in a way that suggests the deliberate destruction of the object as part of the act of giving it to the water. The practice of depositing valuable objects in water, in rivers and lakes and bogs, is one of the most widespread and persistent features of prehistoric and early historic European material culture. Rivers in Britain have produced remarkable quantities of Bronze Age and Iron Age metalwork, swords and shields and cauldrons and ornaments, all deliberately placed. Flag Fen is one of the most systematically excavated examples of this practice anywhere in Britain, and the new analysis of the Flag Fen finds conducted between 2017 and 2022, using techniques not available in the original excavation period, has produced findings that significantly revise the understanding of the site. The most significant finding concerns the metalwork. Detailed metallurgical analysis of the bronze objects from Flag Fen, analyzing the composition of the alloys and the trace elements that reflect the specific ore sources used, has shown that the metalwork at Flag Fen is not simply local Bronze Age material from the surrounding region. Some of the objects show elemental signatures consistent with metal sources in continental Europe, particularly from ore deposits in the Alps and in the Iberian Peninsula. The Alps again. The same source that appears in the geological identification of the chlorite schist object at the Ness of Brodgar. The same general region that has been appearing repeatedly in the trace element analysis of Bronze Age metalwork across Britain over the last decade of more systematic geochemical analysis. In the Bronze Age, the connection to continental Europe is less surprising than in the Neolithic. Bronze Age trade networks are well documented and are known to have operated across the whole of Europe. The appearance of alpine metal at a site in Cambridgeshire fits within a known framework of long-distance exchange, but the specific character of the Flag Fen deposits adds something to that framework. These were not traded goods that ended up at Flag Fen as part of normal exchange. They were objects that someone chose to deposit in the water at a specific sacred place. The journey of the metal from the Alps to Cambridgeshire was not the end of the object's story. It was a preliminary. The significant act was the deposition. What does it mean to give something from far away to the water? What does it mean to travel with an object, or to receive an object through a chain of exchanges, knowing that its final destination is the water at Flag Fen? It means that the significance of the object is connected to its origin, that the connection it embodies, between this place and that place, between the wetlands of Cambridgeshire and the mountains of the Alps, is part of what makes it worth giving away. The gift to the water carries not just the value of the metal, but the value of the distance it has travelled, the connections it represents, the wider world that the act of deposition is bringing into relationship with this specific sacred place. The water receives the world. There is a word in Welsh, hiraeth, that has no precise English equivalent. It describes a kind of longing for home, for a place or time that may no longer exist, combined with a sense of grief for what has been lost. It is sometimes described as homesickness for a home you cannot return to, or perhaps a home you never had. It carries within it a sense of the distance between the present and a past that was more complete, more real, more connected. It is not a word that the Neolithic builders of Britain's monuments would have known in its Welsh form, since the Welsh language did not exist yet. But the feeling it names is not linguistic, it is human. And when you stand at Stonehenge, or at the Ness of Brodgar, or at the edge of what was once Doggerland, and look at what remains of the world those people built, what the feeling resembles most closely is a form of hiraeth, a longing for a world more connected than we have tended to imagine, a grief for the knowledge that was lost when the communities that held it changed and scattered and were replaced. A sense of incompleteness, of a story only partially recoverable, of voices only partially audible across the millennia. The ruins speak, but they do not speak clearly. They hint, they suggest, they provide data points that allow us to reconstruct fragments of what was there. And every reconstruction is partial. Every interpretation is contested. Every finding raises new questions that will take years or decades to answer. This is not a failing. It is the condition of working with the deep past. And the appropriate response to it is not frustration but patience. The patience to keep looking, to keep applying new methods to old problems, to keep listening for what the stones and the bones and the chemistry are trying to say. Because what they are saying, what the last 15 years of discovery has made increasingly clear, is worth hearing. These were not simple times. These were not simple people. The world they inhabited was connected in ways we are only beginning to understand. The knowledge they held was sophisticated in ways that our standard models did not predict. The meanings they made were complex in ways that the fragmentary physical record can only hint at. They were our ancestors in the ways that matter, not genetically, necessarily, but intellectually, emotionally, in their curiosity and their ambition and their care for what came after them. They left us the ruins. They left us the stones and the bones and the earthworks and the astronomical alignments. They left us what they could. They built for permanence, knowing they would not be here to explain it. We are here, explaining it to ourselves as best we can, with the tools we have now. And every discovery that shocks us, every finding that requires us to revise what we thought we knew, is also a discovery that brings us closer to them. That makes the gap slightly smaller. That allows us to hear, if not the words, at least the shape of the thought behind them. That is what the ruins of ancient Britain have been doing for 5,000 years, waiting to be understood, getting slowly closer. The night is settling now. The questions that this account has raised will not be resolved tonight. Many of them will not be resolved in this generation of researchers. Some of them may never be fully resolved because the evidence that would resolve them is gone, dissolved into the soil or swallowed by the sea. But resolution is not the only thing that matters. Understanding in process matters. The asking of better questions matters. The accumulation of evidence that makes the picture more complex and more rich and more surprising matters. Britain's most mysterious ruins have been doing all of this for 5,000 years. They have been provoking questions and resisting easy answers and rewarding careful attention with genuine surprise. They will continue to do all of this for as long as they stand, and for as long as there are people willing to stand before them and look carefully and ask what they are seeing. This is the invitation they extend to every generation that comes to them, not to have the answer, to stay with the question. The stones are still standing. The mist is still moving over the plain. Somewhere in the Orcadian night, the walls of the Ness of Brodgar are waiting under their protective cover for the next field season, for the next careful hand with the next careful trowel. Somewhere in the fenlands of Cambridgeshire, the peat is still holding what it holds for the next excavation, the next analysis, the next finding that changes the picture slightly and makes it more true. Somewhere in the uplands of Wales, the oldest stone walls in Britain rest under the grass, visited only by sheep and occasional walkers who have no idea what is beneath their feet. Somewhere at the bottom of the North Sea, Doggerland is still there, silent, patient, still giving up its secrets to the fishing nets and the acoustic surveys, a piece at a time. The world was always larger than we thought. The past was always deeper. The people were always more capable. The connections were always more extensive. We keep finding this out, and each time we find it out, it is both a surprise and a confirmation. A surprise because the specific finding exceeds what we predicted. A confirmation because it is consistent with everything else that is accumulating into a new picture of human prehistory. A picture of a world in which people, even very ancient people, even people without writing or metal or wheels, were fully themselves, fully human, fully engaged with the world around them, and with the world beyond the horizon, and with the world of the dead beneath the earth, and the world of the sky above. They were here. They built things. They knew things. They cared deeply about things, and they left behind enough evidence in the soil and the stone and the chemistry of old bones for us to be, just barely, beginning to understand what those things were. Sleep now. The ruins will still be there in the morning. They have been waiting a long time. They can wait a little longer, but they are patient because they have something to say. And we are finally, properly, beginning to listen. Good night. There is a particular kind of silence that exists in the chambered tombs of Neolithic Britain. Not the silence of absence, because the stones themselves have a presence, a weight, and a solidity that presses on the senses in a way that empty space does not. It is more the silence of waiting, of something held in suspension, of a space designed to receive something, prepared for something, opened to something that has not yet arrived but is expected. When archaeologists enter the chambers of these tombs for excavation work, they report, almost universally, an experience that the dry language of archaeological reports rarely captures, the sense of entering a different kind of time. The way the outside world, the sound of wind and birds, the feel of moving air, the changing light of the sky, all of this drops away within a few feet of passing the entrance stones. What replaces it is that particular silence, and a temperature that stays constant regardless of the season, and a quality of stillness that the body registers as significant before the mind can articulate why. The people who built these spaces knew this experience. They built specifically to produce it. The thickness of the walls, the low and narrow entrance passages, the transition from the living landscape outside to the still and sealed interior, all of these are architectural choices that engineer a specific sensory experience. You are not just entering a building. You are crossing a boundary. You are moving from the world of the living, with its wind and weather and movement, into something else, something that the builders clearly understood as requiring a different quality of attention. What they did in those spaces, what the ceremonies involved, what words were spoken or what sounds were made, we do not know. The archaeology of ceremony leaves almost no trace. But the architecture of ceremony is there in the stones, the deliberate engineering of the boundary experience, the calculated isolation from the ordinary world, the alignment of the entrance passage so that specific light could enter at specific moments, making the darkness visible, making the transition between the sealed space and the living sky momentary and dramatic. These were spaces designed for the most significant human experiences, for grief and ceremony and whatever form of communion with the dead, these communities understood to be possible. For the particular kind of knowing that comes only in stillness and darkness and the presence of the ancient. When we stand at the entrance of Maeshowe on a clear December afternoon and watch the light of the setting sun travel down the passage and illuminate the back wall of the chamber, we are witnessing something that was designed 5,000 years ago specifically to be witnessed. An event that has been happening every December for 5,000 years, whether anyone was watching or not, because the stones are in the right position and the sun is in the right place, and the alignment works as surely now as it did the day the final stone was placed. 5,000 winters. The same alignment, the same light in the same chamber. The people who built it are gone. The knowledge of what it meant to them is gone, but the structure they built to produce this moment endures, and the moment itself endures, and in witnessing the moment we are connected, however imperfectly and however partially, to the intention of people who lived in a world so different from ours that the distance is almost impossible to comprehend. Almost, but not quite, because the intention itself is recognizable, the desire to mark the turning of the year, the desire to bring light into the darkest place at the darkest time, the desire to make something permanent and beautiful and true to the movements of the sky. These are not alien desires, they are entirely human, recognizable across 5,000 years of change in everything else. The ruins of Britain are full of these moments of recognition, places where the distance collapses, briefly, and something communicates across the gap. Not a message that can be decoded, or a knowledge that can be extracted and filed, but a recognition, an acknowledgement, moving in both directions across the millennia, that we are the same kind of thing. That we share the condition of being briefly alive in a world that is vastly larger and older than any individual life. That the desire to understand that world and to mark our passage through it in ways that will outlast us is not something that technology or civilization invented. It is something that the people who carved the first cut marks into the stones of Avebury already knew, in their bones, in their hands, in the particular care with which they pressed pigment into the hollow surface of a stone, standing in the earliest morning light, of a world that was already, even then, ancient beyond their reckoning. We are not at the beginning of anything. We are somewhere in the middle of a very long story. The ruins are the evidence of how much has come before us. And the discoveries being made in and around those ruins, year by year, finding by finding, are how we are slowly, patiently learning to read that evidence. The story is not over. The ruins are not finished speaking. And you, in the dark, in the quiet at the end of this long account, are part of the audience they have always been waiting for. Rest now. Carry the stones with you into sleep. The ancient alignment, the light at midwinter, the carved hand pressed against cold rock, 5,000 miles and 5,000 years from here. I was here. Remember me. Let me leave you with one last image. One last detail from the archaeology of ancient Britain that has stayed with me through all of the research and all of the discoveries and all of the surprising findings that this account has traced. In the 2019 excavation at the Ness of Brodgar, among the many objects recovered from the intact floor of Structure 10, there was one small item that the excavation team photographed and catalogued and sent to the laboratory for analysis, and then, during the long months of waiting for results, found themselves thinking about more than almost anything else from the entire season. It was a piece of red ochre, not a carved piece, not a piece that had been worked into a specific form. Just a lump of the mineral, roughly the size and shape of a large walnut, one end of it worn smooth from use, and the other end bearing a flat face that showed clearly how it had been used. Someone had held this piece of ochre in their hand, pressing the flat end against a surface, applying the pigment to something. A stone wall, another person's skin, an object being prepared for ceremony or burial or some purpose we cannot determine. The ochre was worn to exactly the right shape for the hand that had used it. You could feel, looking at the photographs, how it would have sat in the palm, how the thumb would have rested against the worn, smooth end, how the pressure of a human grip over many uses had shaped the mineral to its purpose. Someone had held this small red stone in their hand many times, for many purposes, in that building on the Orkney Peninsula 4,500 years ago. And then the building was sealed. The roof was pushed in. The floor deposit, with everything that lay on it and in it, was covered and preserved and left to wait for 4,500 years, until a careful hand, wearing nitrile gloves, reached into the earth of a Neolithic floor and picked it up again. The warmth of the hand that last held it is long gone. The name of the person who wore it smooth is unknown and will remain unknown. What they were doing with it, what they were marking or colouring or preparing, is a question that the chemistry can only partially address and that the imagination must fill in with whatever feels most true. But the object itself, shaped by a hand, bearing the traces of a human purpose, is real. It sat on that floor for 4,500 years, and it is real, and it is in the custody of archaeologists who are doing everything they can to understand what it means and what it tells us about the people who used it. That is what the ruins of ancient Britain contain. Not just data, not just alignments and isotopes and ancient DNA, but this, the worn, smooth ochre that fits the hand. The small carved figure in alpine stone, the painted surfaces of buildings that no longer stand, the bones of people who travelled extraordinary distances to be included in monuments they may never have seen completed. The full weight of a human past that was richer and stranger and more connected and more ambitious and more beautiful than we had given it credit for. We owe those people the best attention we can give, the best methods, the best analysis, the most honest and the most open-minded interpretation of what they left behind. And we owe it to ourselves to be genuinely surprised when the evidence exceeds our expectations. To allow the shock of discovery to do what it is supposed to do, to revise not just what we know but how we think about what we know, to make us better at understanding, more humble about what we do not yet understand, more excited about what remains to be found. Britain's most mysterious ruins have done all of this. They are still doing it. They will keep doing it. The work continues. The discoveries continue. The conversation between the present and the ancient past continues, imperfect and partial and full of gaps, but genuine, and that is the right note on which to close. Not with an answer, with a continuing question, not with certainty, with the honest acknowledgement that the most important things are still being understood, not with the end of the story, with the recognition that the story is very, very long and we are somewhere in the middle of it, and the middle is an extraordinary place to be. Good night. Sleep well. Dream of old stones and new findings and the long, patient, extraordinary work of listening to what the ruins are still trying to say. They have been waiting a long time. They are still here. And so are we. Somewhere in the dark right now, the standing stones of Callanish on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides are receiving what they always receive. The Atlantic wind coming in off the sea, carrying the smell of salt and distance. The sky above them, turning slowly on its ancient axis, the same stars in the same positions they have held for 5,000 years, shifted only imperceptibly by the long, slow wobble of the Earth's pole that takes 26,000 years to complete its circuit. The Callanish stones were raised around 3000 BCE. They form a cross-shaped arrangement, unique in the British megalithic tradition, with a long avenue of paired stones approaching a central circle from the north, and shorter rows extending east, west, and south. At the center of the circle stands the tallest stone, over 5 meters high, aligned to something that researchers are still working to fully characterize. The precise astronomical significance of the Callanish alignment has been debated for decades. What is clear is that the stones were positioned deliberately, with knowledge of the sky, with a purpose that has not yet been fully recovered. On the night of the major lunar standstill, the maximum southern moonrise in the 18-6-year cycle, the moon appears to skim along the horizon as seen from Callanish, seeming almost to touch the tops of the hills to the south, before rising between the avenue stones and setting again in a display that early observers described as the moon walking on the earth. This event, which the stones appear to have been specifically designed to mark, happens once every 18.6 years. It has been happening since the stones were raised. It will keep happening as long as the stones stand. 5,000 years and counting. Rest now. The ancient sky turns, the old stones wait, and somewhere the answer is still in the earth.